Good afternoon. On behalf of the American Enterprise Institute, it's a pleasure to welcome you to 3 conversations on digital platforms and American life. And welcome to all of you who have joined us in person and to all of you joining us online. Technological innovation presents great opportunities for human flourishing and also great challenges for good governance. It's always been true, but it feels truer than ever these days in an era of transformative innovation in the technologies of American culture, communication, and education. When today's digital platforms, especially social media, began to emerge less than 2 decades ago, some may have foreseen some of the questions and challenges that the platforms would raise, but surely none of us foresaw all of them. And by the same token, we must look forward to the future of technology and government with more than a little humility about our ability to predict what's yet to come. Then again, grappling simply with what's already before us presents more than enough food for thought. And for the last 2 years, with the generous support from the Knight Foundation, AEI has convened a wide range of interdisciplinary discussions focused on the relationships between digital platforms, governing institutions, and our own lives. So we've called this program, admittedly not very creatively, the AEI Project on Digital Platforms and American Life. And from this series of discussions, we're now producing a series of essays. The first several are already available online at platforms.aei.org, and many more will appear on that site in the weeks and months ahead. Again, all this was made possible by the generous support of the Knight Foundation. The essays have already spurred further debate online, and we hope they'll continue to do so in the months to come and to help inform the work of policymakers and scholars and all Americans. And now it's our pleasure to bring some of these discussions to AEI's auditorium with many of the experts who have authored essays in the series and some other expert guests. Our first panel will focus on one of the most politically and culturally salient aspects of digital platforms, namely the future of content moderation and social media. So I'll turn it over to our moderator, AEI's own Yuval Levin, director of AEI's program on social, cultural, and constitutional studies. He'll introduce our featured speakers, so please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you very much, Adam. I appreciate that. As Adam mentioned, I'm Yuval Levin here at AEI, and it's a great pleasure for me to be kicking this off. I really do recommend to you taking a look at the papers that have been published already in this series, and you can get a sense there too at platforms.ai.org of the papers that are coming. It's an extraordinary range of views on what are really an exceptionally difficult set of questions now facing policymakers. If you've had the experience that I have of sitting in the back of a congressional hearing and listening to members talk about some of these issues, then you know that they need help, a lot of help. The challenges they're facing are very complex. They're in some sense new, in some sense they are familiar and profound. They cut to the heart of some core constitutional questions, some familiar and long-standing kinds of economic challenges and regulatory issues, but exactly how they apply and what they mean and what algorithm means are the sorts of questions that our politicians need the kind of help with that we at AEI and that others in this community of policy scholars can offer. And that's what this project is really aiming to do. This first panel takes up one of the most prominent ways in which some really core governance questions have been arising in the work of the digital platforms. And the question is basically, what are the responsibilities of the platforms in setting and enforcing rules for content, for what can be communicated across the platform? And so in exercising some control over what can be said, what can be sent, under what circumstances, it's a question that raises further very difficult questions about corporate responsibility and government responsibility, about property rights and speech rights, about community standards and national priorities. Who has the authority to set rules in these domains? On whose behalf? To what end? Policymakers clearly need the kind of guidance that this sort of work can offer when they take up these questions. And to begin with, we've got a great panel of experts here to discuss this set of questions, the question of content moderation on the platforms to begin with. Each has written a paper for our series, and each comes at these issues from a slightly different angle or form of expertise, which should make for a great conversation. I'll briefly introduce them. They'll each tell us a bit about what they wrote about and how they think about this, and then we'll open up a conversation. I'm going to start by introducing John Samples, who is, I can assure you that John is a real person and exists not only on the metaverse, though also on the metaverse. But he couldn't be here today, and so we're glad that we can have him in this remote way. John is the vice president of the Cato Institute. He's director of Cato's Center for Representative Government. He's also a member of Meta's Oversight Board, which provides binding decisions on whether specific content can be allowed or removed from Facebook and Instagram. He's an expert on the First Amendment, on American constitutionalism, has been published in countless outlets, and we're sorry he couldn't be here in person, but very grateful that he could be here in this way. Christine Rosen is my colleague here at the American Enterprise Institute. She's a senior fellow at AI, where she focuses especially on the intersection of technology and culture. She's also a columnist for Commentary Magazine and a fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and a senior editor at the New Atlantis magazine. Her next book, The Extinction of Experience, will be published next year, and she's frequently published in many outlets. And finally, Brett Swanson is another of our colleagues, a non-resident senior fellow here at AEI, where he focuses on the impact of technology on the U.S. economy, telecommunications, internet regulation, related issues. He's also the president of Entropy Economics and a scholar at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. He's been a congressional aide, director of the Center for Global Innovation at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, and also is published all over the place on these kinds of issues. All of them bring to bear very valuable insight and experience in these areas. We're going to proceed very simply. We will have each of them speak for a bit in the order in which I introduced them, starting with John, and then we'll open up a conversation among them, and ultimately also with the folks who are gathered here in person, and with those of you who are watching online. If you do want to participate online, there are two ways that you can pose questions to our panelists. You can do it by email, to Sophie Raziri at AI.org, or through the hashtag AEI Digital Platforms. And if you're watching us online, you can see both of those on the screen where you're watching, so that should make it easy to ask your questions. And with that, we'll begin with John, so please.
Thank you very much, Yuval. I too regret very much not being at the conference. I've looked forward to this for a long time, and to not be able to attend is not great. But I would also like to thank the Knight Foundation, who supported my work in other regards and certainly contributed to this particular piece in some measure. And I would also like to thank AEI, Adam White in particular, for all the work that's been done here on this. I think this is a great project, and it's really going to the issues that, in my other hat at Meta, are really relevant. I mean, I think these are highly relevant policy issues for the companies, the platforms. So what I thought I would do is start with the status quo and move outward from there, and make some comments that would indicate my position, and also some issues we have before us that might provoke further thought and comment down the line. So the status quo is that platforms generally have the right to police their property, which is to say they have the right to do content moderation. It's legally valid to take down legal speech. Now, they are restrained by probably three factors. One is they have to try to maximize shareholder value. That's a background here. It's often ignored, but it's certainly true. They are restrained by certain laws. I'm thinking here of civil rights laws. It could be other laws that would also apply. But what they are, I should also say, they're restrained by jawboning by government, which we've seen a little bit of that from the Biden administration, and you're going to see that from most governments, I think. Jawboning is a new paper by my colleague Will Duffield at Cato, and he looks at this idea that without taking unconstitutional measures, governments try to pressure the platforms into taking down or leaving up speech. But in the end, they're not restrained. The companies are not restrained by the First Amendment, and so they can act broadly on their other interests. Now, that's two complaints that are well known. There's, on one side, there's people complain of errors of omission. The speech on the platform is said to constitute threats to democracy in various ways, and the companies are pressured to take down more speech. Of concern today, however, are errors of commission. That is, the complaint that too much speech is being taken down, and then that should call forth a public response. Now, I should say that it seems to me still, after 3 or 4 years of looking at this, that the most likely forward path for content moderation is the status quo, given that neither side, those who want to take down more or leave up more, are likely to have a clear enough power to enforce their preference through the legislature. So you're likely to that is the problem. And it's a problem that comes up in other areas of policy too, when both sides discover that in fact one side wants to take down stuff, the other side wants to leave up stuff. So we're likely to have a gridlock for the time being, but then maybe not. I don't know the future for sure, and who does, right? So I want to focus on the arrows of commission. That is the idea that too much speech is being taken down. In general, I come out of a campaign finance background of 10 years or so more ago, a long struggle about the effects of private activity, funding campaigns on the public good. There I learned that you really should be systematic and detailed about when you make claims. And here we find, as to regard the systematic suppression of speech, in my opinion, a lack of systematic proof. And a recognition that most of the speech regulation now is done by algorithms, now more than 90% in almost all cases. And so that is done by setting of points of confidence levels, right? How sure do you want to be that this violates the rules or so on? I suspect, however, that is all beside the political point. I also suspect that if we look just at anecdotes, my own example, I was on a case where a sort of left-leaning artist from Canada published something on her Facebook page that said, "Kill the Indian." It was taken down immediately. It was a criticism of certain policies of the United States government in the 1880s that she believed had resonance today. And so that was taken down. That was left-leaning. On the other hand, last night, a friend of mine published something on there or republished something on their Facebook page. It stated clearly that people are not born gay, that God would not make people gay, and so on. As of the last check, over 24 hours later, and I should say also went with that, this was part of a political struggle about public school policy, about transgenderism. There was a call to action to mobilize and bring pressure to bear on the local schools. 24 hours later, all of that is still up on the Facebook, on their Facebook pages. So it's difficult to say actually whether or not there is an attempt to systematically drown out conservative voices. I would think that if there were, the particularly calls to action would be targeted. But here we see a case not. But that's just an anecdote, and that's what most people have. The proof here, though, it dawned on me eventually, was that it doesn't involve studies, statistics, controls, and all of that stuff. There's general agreement on the right that such bias exists, from the most careful to the least careful person on the right, that agreement. So you have to ask the question, why do they believe that? And the answer is, it's rooted in a distrust of Silicon Valley. It's rooted for some people, in a distrust of Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook and Meta, and more generally the left. That is the idea. There's no expectation that people on the left will grant free speech rights to others when they have a choice, and that you can look at ideas like 94% of Facebook employees donated to the Democratic Party. And from that grows a reasonable expectation that I don't think that's going to lead. I find it wholly unsurprising, the average conservative says, that sooner or later there's going to be a takedown and it's going to be systematic. And you have to say, as I do in the paper, when you think about it for a minute, no one on the left would be all that trusting either if somehow the staff of the Heritage Foundation ran the content moderation operation at Facebook. So that's your problem. But it's a problem not so much of reason and so on, but of distrust. And so, fortunately, what then is the actual problem, though? I mean, there's no First Amendment right, there's no right to equality. So, what is the actual problem? And it seems to me that the actual problem is that the idea of which was once called a appearance of corruption. That is, that a private activity in elections and policymaking can create an appearance of corruption in the sense that it can cause people to lose confidence in elections and the outcomes of elections and policy debates and the outcomes of policy debates. So you think about the events of the last few years, and you can see that there's a credible case, a plausible case to be made that a distrust in, and again, this doesn't have to be solid facts. It's more about distrust and what people suspect, and it has perhaps needs to be plausible. That all of that could create a lack of confidence. So that would be, then you don't have to get to the question that is the other big question here. Do the companies have a First Amendment right to do content moderation? So what has been recognized by the 11th Circuit as and as long time expected, a right to editorial control over the platform. You can still have that, and with this idea that the platforms are destroying public confidence in the elections, you can still have regulations of a sort. It's going to be somewhat limited, probably, and it's going to be it'll have to fit in some ways with that the existence of that First Amendment right. But there is a balancing there. Now, why would there be a First Amendment right? I think the answer goes to you can find that actually in the 11th Circuit decision about the Florida social media law. And it seems to me, if you look at, and I'm most familiar with Facebook, obviously, if you look at their content moderation, their community standards, what you find is something that's very clearly looks like political values, political commitments, and therefore that you can conclude that the content moderation itself is a kind of expressive content, which is generally protected under the First Amendment. I would challenge anyone that doubted that to look at what Facebook in particular says. And Facebook says more, I think, than anyone else, any of the other social media, about all of this. They clearly, with an engineer's mind, they sort of select values and say, we're talking about trade-offs among these values. These are our values. These are the rules that come out of those values, and so on. So it is not simply kinds of business rules, really, at the end of the day, that are involved. And so there's a First Amendment right that strikes me as pretty strong, and that the only way to balance it off, really, is to look at something like this deep distrust, which is in fact the problem, right? I mean, I think the companies should be aware of that and should be trying to deal with that. I would note also, before turning to the Fifth Circuit decision, there is some. I was speaking with Brad Smith about a week ago about all of this, and we both noted, there's something strange about the Texas decision, which is that it's completely repudiates a property right involved here, right? These companies grew up and made these decisions, and they own that property, and so on. And yet, the decision of the Fifth Circuit in what may become, we hope, the infamous footnote 43 is a denunciation of Lochner-era jurisprudence that would befit Cass Sunstein, right? It's about, certainly these companies have no property rights whatsoever, and so on. So essentially what has happened is, because we live in the post-Lochner era, because we live in really the Caroline products era after 1938, the question of the First Amendment having higher values, a higher value before the courts, means that you're going to end up with some kind of First Amendment mixing with property rights. And indeed, I think that's what's happened here. That's what Facebook says, not just in their on the line, online, also in the things they say in passing. Now, so the great alternative to all of this is to essentially, if you're concerned about false positives, about errors of commission, you essentially say that they are a common carrier, that there is no First Amendment right at stake, and that the federal government or state government has a right to compel the companies to keep speech on the platform that they don't otherwise wish to keep online. Now, this seems to me to have several problems with it, apart from the fact that a general concern about government intervention in both speech and the running of a business. You have to, first of all, think about the cost of this. Richard talks about being a consequentialist in his paper for AEI. Well, the consequences of this are going to be pretty significant. There's going to be losses to the company, to the shareholders. There's also probably it's going to you have if you're going to try if it's overly broad, you're going to have keep spam online and so on. But even if you try to look at viewpoint discrimination, you get into a series of issues about we're accustomed to viewpoint discrimination in the public sphere being a very strong right. That is, government cannot practice viewpoint discrimination. But it's certainly true that Facebook does practice viewpoint discrimination, right? If you look at the rules, they reflect viewpoints. For example, they have a rule against dangerous individuals and organizations. Terrorism is a viewpoint. They reflect that they don't like those views and they keep them off the platform, even when they're not incitement to violence. So if you have some kind of rule that prevents, if you could enforce it, which I can find it, I kind of doubt, you're going to throw into question the whole question of terror. Richard says, well, that's a libelous thing or could possibly libelous thing to say. Keep in mind that just under half of all of the designations of terror or dangerous people and organizations on the Facebook platform comes from the United States government. They just take over wholesale the government list, right? So you're going to have that on the hate speech side in the United States. That might lead to some improvements on the free speech, but in other countries, remember, 10% of Facebook users live in the United States, and they elsewhere, what we call hate speech or derogatory speech toward minority groups is uncomfortably linked to violence in ways that an incitement standard is not going to make good, I think. And so I think there's real cost on those kinds of arguments. So let me finish up by saying what I think in just general might be a good way to look toward the future. First of all, I think that the content moderation of the future needs to have a certain sensibility to it, which is this. It has to draw the distinction between the view that if you take, having online the view that if you take a vaccine, you will become metallic on the one hand, which is low-grade speech of little value and perhaps some significant cost on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Great Barrington Declaration, right? There is a role, I think, given we also don't know a whole lot about virality and the effects of it and so on in terms of benefit and cost. There's a role for making that distinction. It may not be great if you have anti-vaxxers exposed to people who have not been exposed to them, and it could lead to actual deaths and so on. However, at the same time, you have to absolutely draw a firm line on everything that needs to be said. And so, for example, Facebook's recent foray into having fact checkers seek out whether the Biden administration was in a recession or not was totally a mistake. Those things should be completely off limits. And Facebook and others could use a kind of incitement standard that looks to actual physical harm for trying to deal with this. And if that is true, remember, Facebook has taken down 25 million posts that led to actual physical harm or would have. So in general, I think it's likely that Facebook and perhaps the Oversight Board, or with the Oversight Board's guidance, I hope, will be the future of content moderation. However, this needs to be done with a very light hand and with clear distinctions and with a presumption in favor of speech when in doubt. And that's going to be the great challenge.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks.
Very rich comments and a lot to work with there. Christine, we'll go to you next, and then Brett.
Thanks. I was very glad to hear John use the word trust quite a bit in his remarks that he just made, because I think that was the approach I took in looking at this broader question of content moderation. And I also just want to say, personally, as someone who's deeply skeptical of Facebook from day one, that the fact that John is on the oversight board is the only reason I have a smidge of optimism about our future social media platforms. That being said, the question I wanted to wrestle with was, do these social media platforms have civic responsibilities? Seems pretty straightforward, right? We ask this question all the time. Regulators ask it, elected officials ask it, consumers ask it. I don't think it's the right question. I think by framing the question in that way, we actually miss having debates that could be richer and more nuanced and more interesting, and get into some of the details in a more productive way, like John did in his paper, which I commend to all of you to read. And here's why. When we talk about civic responsibility, that helps the platforms talk about civic responsibility. And by that I mean, if we look to a 2019 speech that Mark Zuckerberg gave at Georgetown University, much hyped, covered by the media. They announced the Facebook Oversight Board. He announced the creation of it during the speech, got a lot of attention. It was the soaring rhetoric of a would-be student body president who sees a great political future for himself. He talked about Facebook as a public square. He talked about free expression over and over, using constitutional language, using First Amendment language, using civic language in a way that was meant to convey Meta's focus on allowing free speech, on really wanting ideas to flourish. It was great as PR, and it was extremely dangerous as a guideline for how we should be looking at these platforms. And I say that for two reasons. The first is that I don't think that you can call a privately owned corporation a public entity in the way that I think Zuckerberg would like us to think of Facebook, and Twitter too. Elon Musk has talked about Twitter as a public square. They all use this language for a reason. It's unhelpful because the public civic spaces we have a couple of things in physical space that the online world doesn't have. Boundaries, agreed upon rules, trust, for the most part, in these spaces, and citizens who participate, not users, not consumers. So it's not a fair thing to talk about these as civic spaces. We can talk about having civic and political discussions on these private spaces, but the public versus civic distinction, I think, public and civic versus private distinction is important. The second thing is, this really helps the platforms in a way that allows them to not get into the nitty-gritty questions about free expression and what are the limits of the First Amendment and how much speech do we outsource, how much content moderation do we outsource to human beings versus algorithms versus AI. I mean, these debates are really important for the consumer to have and to have some transparency on. What we're not having those. And to go to Zuckerberg's speech, he talked about how Facebook and other social media platforms function as a fifth estate. And this really caught my eye because the fourth estate, as we all know, is the media, right? Watchdog, accountability folks, the folks who we trust to tell us the truth about what's really going on and to hold the powerful accountable. Except that we don't do that anymore, right? We don't trust our fourth estate very much, certainly if you look at polls. So the idea that at the moment where trust in the fourth estate was plummeting, Mark Zuckerberg would stand up and say, but look at us, we're a fifth estate. To hold himself and his platform up as a means of accountability struck me as odd. And I mistrusted his motivation for doing so. So I think what we should think about are two things. How regulators and elected officials look at this. There are many more experts in this room and on this platform that with me today who can speak to that much more than I can. I'm concerned about how the users of these platforms think about them and how the owners and powerful people like Zuckerberg talk about them, because I think the public is being misled and ends up having debates about content moderation that are unproductive, highly partisan, and usually come down to finger pointing about, but the laptop is real. No, it's not. You know, the vaccine does this. No, it doesn't. And that's distracting from two things. One, where we could be having better and more useful debates about this, and what the obligations of these private corporations are to their consumer users. So there's some interesting research being done out of University of Utah about how people feel about these platforms when it comes to political debate. And users of these platforms themselves report that they don't really like to have political debates on them, despite what we're always hearing about how everyone's grandma's screaming at everyone else's uncle about Trump. In fact, people report, we kind of like watching everybody fight. It's very much more the Coliseum than it is the public square, right? It's really fun to watch all these people argue, but I don't feel that comfortable getting involved myself. So there is a shift occurring in terms both of people's sophistication about how these platforms work, and also what the role is of these platform moderators to do anything about these. And this is where I will err on, and agree with John that we should always err on the side of free expression here. But they do have a right to moderate. To the sort of political, ideological monoculture that exists in Silicon Valley, that's where I'm on the side of my conservative friends who say, this is a problem, and it is a problem, but it's not a problem necessarily that law is able to solve. So I think that one of the things that John raised in his paper, which really, really has me up late at night now, is the fact that when January 6th happened, one of the things that lots of people who were banned from saying certain things on social media platforms were told by those who supported such bans was, well, just go start your own thing, right? Go start your own platform. Go do your own social media site. Don't muddy up ours with all your crazy conspiracy theories. So some people did that, right? They created Parler, they created other platforms, except those platforms were hosted by Amazon Web Services, which then denied their ability to host the alternative. So you can have many justifications for doing that. I think Amazon made its case for why it pulled that site down. However, you can't argue on the one hand that if you don't like the content moderation, go start your own thing, and then still have a kind of ideological monoculture in Silicon Valley that still cuts off the people trying to make their own thing. So we have some tension there. So I'll just end by saying I really don't like the rhetoric of civic responsibility when it comes to talking about what these companies owe their users and what they owe society, because they are not civic organizations and they don't have civic values in mind when they are pursuing their bottom line. That's fine. They're private businesses. This is called free enterprise. Enterprise is in the middle name of this institute. But I do think we should stop talking about it because it redounds to their benefit when we do, because it can serve as cover for some very undemocratic decision-making that goes on in these platforms. John highlighted a few in terms of content moderation. And so we need to find a new language for doing that, and hopefully we can start doing that today.
Thanks very much, Christine. Brett, please.
Yuval, thank you very much, and thanks to Adam White and everybody at AEI for organizing the conference, and thanks to John and Christine for their very thoughtful comments. They've done a great job of summarizing some of the legal issues, some of the policy issues, even some of the sort of social and cultural issues. I'm going to zoom out even maybe a little bit further and try to describe, while I have some views on the legal and policy issues, which I'll maybe discuss later, try to describe why I think this debate is so crucial from a social economic level. I think, in my view, that whether you call it aggressive content moderation, some would prefer the term censorship, they're having profound real-world consequences for the first time, where maybe 5 or 7 years ago it was a petty debate about some, so-called fringe character getting thrown off. I think today it is impacting the most serious social and economic debates of our time. And when I say that, I'm talking specifically, say, about today's European energy crisis, which is spreading around the world, and of course, COVID-19, which we've been through the last 2.5 years. First, before I get to those specific instances, let me offer one possible explanation for why we may be seeing a return of aggressive content moderation, again, possibly you might call it sort of more censorious behavior over the last number of years, and not just on social media, but across our cultural and media institutions. And I think it starts really with the power of the internet itself. So about 15 years ago, I wrote a Wall Street Journal article called "The Coming Exaflood," which was all about this absolute explosion of new explosion of volume of content, types of content, billions of smartphones that we saw coming our way. Now, I was not as insightful about what the social implications of this exaflood would be. And I'd go to, say, Martin Gurry, who wrote a book in 2014 originally, updated in 2018, called The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. And he really saw what was coming as far as the social implications of this internet information explosion. And he argued that billions of cell phones, social media, texting with anybody across the world was going to both sort of expose the real and perceived flaws of the existing authorities of many types, and also increase the rapidity and volume of everyday people's ability to criticize those authorities. And he thought that this was a revolution in the fundamental relationship between the governors and the governed. Now, I think this happened. You saw it in Brexit. You saw it in the surprising election of 2016. You've seen it in the tumult of our politics ever since. And I think this challenge to authorities inspired a understandable and absolutely ferocious response to sort of what they thought was their place in society, whether it was in media, whether it was in universities, whether it was corporations, whether it was political leaders, to tamp down what they saw as this new, chaotic, uncontrollable digital rabble, right? And so this new sort of more aggressive content moderation, again, not just on social media, is sort of an understandable response to this exaflood of information for everyday people. Now, my view is that misinformation is sort of the normal state of the world. Most of the stuff we hear and say and read, most of it isn't absolutely correct, or right? And so the whole progress of civilization, right, is sort of trying to be less wrong about things over time, whether that's understanding the natural world, whether it's the economy, where the market mechanism sorts out bad ideas from good ideas. But the presumption that we can know what is misinformation, especially from the top layer of the stack, is a key conceit that I think is getting wrong. So the internet was this amazingly powerful alternative to the existing institutions that I think were already heading down the path of sort of what you might call censorious behavior, certainly a monoculture, right, in universities, big media, et cetera. And the internet was this extreme threat to the existing order. Now, it's also true, I think, in this information explosion, that it's very difficult for us to make heads or tails, figure out what's going on. There's too much coming at us from too many different directions, 24/7. It's not just the nightly news and the morning newspaper, it's constant. So in fact, we do need better and more editors, right? We do need better and more curation. We do need more interaction among people. But the question is, at what layer of the stack of information do these editing or curation functions make the most sense for individuals and for social progress, right? So that we actually are inching closer and closer towards the truth. My view is that the social media today is certainly not responsible for these big problems, which I'm going to describe in just a second, but that it amplifies both the existing sort of propaganda of the rest of the media and culture, and it amplifies the severity of the censorship that was already present. And again, social media can't itself lead to all these problems, but as Timur Kuran described in his book, Private Truths, Public Lies, a little censorship, or even threat of censorship, can lead to widespread self-censorship, right? So censoring one doctor or scientist or journalist or analyst, right, can lead thousands of others in the same positions to pull back, right, and not act, not speak. And thus we get, the result often is a phenomenon known as knowledge falsification, right? So the rest of the world is deprived of potentially crucial insights that people who are self-censoring aren't letting the world know. And so that gets me to some of the two big problems that I think are partially a result of this new censorious regime. And I would argue that the energy climate debate over the last 20, even 30 years has been ground zero for these sort of strategies, the sort of climate communication strategy, you could call it, where the scientific journals were captured and purged of any dissidents. The universities certainly were. We had total media blackouts on any thing apart from the conventional approved of narrative. You had demonization and erasure of eminent scientists from MIT and Princeton and all universities all over the world. I'd argue that the same exact playbook we've seen over the last 2.5 years with COVID-19, this time now hyperscaled with our new information tools. So we saw an absolute clampdown, right, on discussion over the origin of SARS-CoV-2, right? Where did it come from? We saw a clampdown on discussion of lockdowns. John mentioned Great Barrington Declaration, right? We saw prohibition on not only discussion, but also prescription by doctors and filling by pharmacists of early treatment options, right? We saw the same talk on masks. We saw the same, and certainly maybe the most censorship around, these amazing mandatory experimental genetic transfection, right? What we call the vaccine, right? I mean, this is a radical experimental new medicine, and we weren't allowed to talk about it for the most part. We can go through hundreds of examples. Alex Berenson, obviously most famously, was kicked off Twitter for saying that the vaccines don't prevent infection and transmission. Of course, he was correct. The Great Barrington Declaration, doctors from Stanford, Oxford, Harvard, said that we should focus on protecting the vulnerable. I think they were absolutely correct, yet they were censored. You had Scott Atlas, his big video on Facebook was taken down as soon as he went to the White House. You have Robert Malone, pioneer of mRNA technology, right, who was kicked off Twitter for saying that mRNA and spike don't stay in your shoulder but spread through the body and persist for a long time. In fact, just in the last couple of weeks, the CDC has removed their statements that, in fact, mRNA and spike do not persist for a long time. He was absolutely right, and he was thrown off Twitter for it. So we've had hundreds of, quote, fact checks from sites like Health Feedback, which I know partners with Facebook, which has been wrong about dozens and dozens and dozens of things, and has been, and which the CDC and FDA have now either explicitly or implicitly disavowed. I could go on forever. My view is that that fact checking and and content moderation on these emergent, hyper complex issues of science, where nobody could possibly have all the answers, are a giant conceit. And in fact, I would argue that with regard to COVID-19, the censorship regime has been a fatal conceit, very literally. And we can see it in the results. So we had worse morbidity and mortality in 2021 than we had in 2020, and even in the first half of 2022. Western nations, in large part, did worse than low-income nations with COVID. Sweden, now we know, 2.5 years in, did better than its Euro neighbors, even though it followed the conventional, old-school Great Barrington Declaration rules of thumb. We have a huge learning loss among American kids because we kept them out of school. Another issue that was censored. Maybe most alarmingly, in 2021, and we just have this new data from the life insurance companies and the Society of Actuaries, which have just come out with a new report. We have, among healthy, employed, working age Americans, all right, we have an unprecedented spike in non-COVID natural deaths in 2021, something like between a 40, 50, 60% spike. These are people between 18 and 64, right? This is something like a 10 sigma event. And then, of course, we have the fact, I think, that whatever you want to call it, lockdown socialism, suppressing supply of goods, services, and labor, and juicing demand through unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus has now led to an inflationary economic meltdown. And I would say that most of this, these terrible consequences of the last 2.5 years could have prevented it. Not, of course, not all, but most. And I would say that the failure to discuss these super complex issues of science, public health, economics, social issues, I really think we have to ask the question whether this has not been the biggest debacle of science and public policy, one of them at least in history. And that's what I want to say is about the real world effects of this censorious attitude that is much broader than social media, but in my view is amplified and made worse by social media.
Thanks very much, Brad. I want to open things up a little bit by trying to bring each of you into conversation just a bit with something that the others have said, and maybe to see if there are places where there's some tensions for us to think about that might clarify some of what's already been said. And maybe, John, to start with you, and just have you respond to the broad question that was at the center of Christine's comments, which is basically, do these companies actually have civic obligations? Is that a category that they should be using in thinking about what they're doing with the extraordinary social power that the ownership of the platforms gives them?
I would say a couple of things about that. And when I read her paper, I thought this. One is that, from my perspective, treating them like something like a public square makes sense because it's not so much the moral conception of civic space is that they're just in the largest cases they're so large that their content moderation and the decisions they make have the ability to plausibly affect the outcomes of elections and policy debate. And that's sort of in a de facto pragmatic and sort of fake non-normative way makes it a civic space, right? I mean, they can affect the ongoing civic life in a profound way, just the sheer enormity. And it's also true, of course, throughout the country, because throughout the world. I would say the other thing too is, for whatever reason, in response to pressures or whatever, and not often noted, including in our panel here, is they systematically took up a civic obligation, but not in the United States. They committed to international human rights laws, or rather, norms. And now Facebook has a large section that does nothing but try to work out the shortcomings and application of human rights norms to various places. And, we must say, some of the most troubled spots on earth is where Facebook is. So they have they have taken up that civic obligation. It's just a much broader one than we usually think of.
Could I?
Please. Yeah.
You're absolutely right, and it's important to note that. I would still suggest these are fairly reactionary positions that these companies are taking, Facebook in particular. For those of you who know what happened in Myanmar, fueled in large part by what was going on Facebook and not stopped led to genocide. I also think that we forget here in the United States in particular, and this is a tension I think all these platforms that are based in Silicon Valley face. These are American companies, but they are having global impact in the sense that they are making, the internet is Facebook in a huge part of this, huge part of the world, right? That's the way people access the internet, through Facebook. Everything is through that pipeline. So when we talk about civic and moral obligations, and I do admire some of the human rights work that they're attempting to do, I remain sort of skeptical of the long-term reason for it. And I feel like we've seen this with Google in China. A lot of those human rights obligations are immediately jettisoned as soon as the bottom line is threatened, right? And again, that's because they're a business. They need to have a bottom line as their consideration. So again, this tension between what is sort of ethical window dressing that looks good for the corporations versus commitment, and I know particularly Facebook, there are units that are fully committed to doing this human rights work, and it's very admirable. I worry though about whether how last hired, first fired, if they're the things that are thrown off the lifeboat first when economic issues come into play.
Brett, you mentioned in your comments that there is some room for content moderation and some rights for content moderation, but then you raised for us the extraordinary difficulties that arise in practical terms when social media functions as a space in which knowledge is developed through disagreement and dispute, which is how knowledge is developed everywhere. John, at the end of his comments, suggested that there needs to be some balance when we think about content moderation, that there needs to be a line that's walked between just open conspiracism and unorthodox views. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's possible to walk that kind of line? What would it look like? How could we get to a place where the companies are able to do something like that?
I think it's very difficult to have any policy or law that can correctly or even approximate correctly drawing those lines. I think it's going to take a new set of competing institutions, competing technologies, a new set of sort of social norms, social rules of thumb, where we get back to sort of a free speech ethos where these things happen more organically, right? So even on a large, I don't think there's any way that on a platform of 2 or 3 billion people, there's going to be any way to moderate content from the top down, right? You're going to have nested groups. You're going to have social and political groups who sort of self-police their own, right? So to say, to encourage what you might call sort of responsible speech or conjectures and ways to say, you know, to sort of weed out the truly dangerous, the truly irresponsible. But even those things are hard to define. And so I don't know how the Supreme Court's going to come down in these issues. I don't know how Congress is going to possibly reform Section 230. I think we can probably do a little bit better in those regards. I think that, you know, I have some ideas about which direction I would like to see things move. But to answer your question, no, I don't think that there are real concrete legal or policy solutions, even policy solutions at the companies themselves. I think this is going to have to take all of us developing new rules of thumb and sort of social understandings to try to make progress.
And it sounds like that has to happen below the level of the overall platform as you see it.
I certainly think so. I think we're making decisions too high up the stack. I think a lot of this has to come down from the middle and below. And a lot of this gets to the, you know, questions that you're dealing with about our sort of non-digital institutions, right? I think we're dealing with these same questions across society and across our politics. And those are the questions our founders were wrestling with, right? Mm-hmm. About sort of what layer do we make decisions at?
And the platforms, as the companies that own the entire system, don't have any particular responsibility for moderation in this scenario?
Yeah, no, I think they do. I think there are some clear-cut cases. You can, you know, talk about Terrorism is the obvious one that we can bring up. That's easy. There are probably some other easy ones. Threats of violence and so forth. But the easy ones are. That's why they're easy. I think it gets really, really tough once you get going down below that. And again, I think that the issue isn't whether one person or one idea gets thrown off. That may not make so much difference. It's this sort of amplification effect that I think really spreads across society where we get a lot of self-censorship because people are so scared for their careers, or whether they're scared that they're going to be the next one thrown off or silenced. And boy, that's a tricky situation.
Christine, how do you think about this? Do the platforms themselves have some responsibility to have a broad set of rules, particular interventions? What does their obligation look like, given the complexity of what they need to do here?
Well, I think they have some of that already, right? They have content rules, but it speaks to the question of trust and legitimacy, right? Because the people are no longer trusting the way those rules are enforced. They think they're political, they think they're haphazard, and what's concerned me lately is that the response of many of these platforms is, and it's a practical response because of the sheer volume of material they're being asked to moderate, is don't worry, we're not leaving this up to fallible humans anymore who might be like too anti-Trump to really be neutral on this political content. It's the algorithm, or we have AI, we have all these machine-oriented ways of solving a very human problem. And you can see this with the development, I'm reading this book about the creation and development of YouTube, and it's fascinating to see these moments where, and obviously the author of this book really loves the creative nerds, so he's heavily leaning on sympathy for them. But a situation where humans had to moderate some of the vile content that would appear on these platforms, and yet would make kind of decisions, and they'd meet up and they'd have discussions about the morality of their choices, and were they being too censorious? Were they actually encouraging free expression? How could they dissuade people from uploading this kind of content? And now it's just the machines, and it really was when Google bought YouTube, it came in and said we're gonna leave this to the machines, and that worries me because those algorithms are still designed by human beings, and if they haven't grappled with the question of nuance in a lot of these debates, we saw this on Facebook when women who were posting selfies while breastfeeding late at night, it became a thing for a while. A lot of that was don't ask me why, I have other concerns about why we're doing this, but in that case, Facebook was taking those pictures down because they read it as porn. Right? There was no distinction between a very heartfelt, intimate moments, which I don't think should be on Facebook, but whatever, people were sharing their experience, it's fine. It couldn't find the nuance, and so I worry that because they can't, I get the sense that they don't really know how to do this either, but instead of saying that, they're coming up with fixes here and there, plugs here and there. I actually like what the Oversight Board is charged with doing, in part because they have some real power. They can say to Facebook, no, you got to reverse this decision, and Facebook follows that. But they're also, I wish we had 100 of those in various contexts for Facebook products and for Google products, because that's what we need. We need some sort of oversight that isn't regulatory, that isn't the jawboning of the government, but that has some perhaps legitimacy for the public to look at and say, I don't know, John, if they've polled you on public sentiment about the Oversight Board, but I think it has a sort of nice, the people I've talked to about it are like, oh, that's a good idea. It's independent. It has a sense of legitimacy. Yeah,
John, I want to ask you about that experience, and let me say before I do that that we will be opening things up for questions both here in the room and online. So if you've got questions, please get them ready or send them along to us. John, you're part of an effort to actually do some of this as a practical matter by the biggest player in this terrain. Tell us a little bit about how the Oversight Board works, and also what your sense is of it. Where is it a model and where is it not?
So it's basically a external, internal appeals court or appeals board that is Facebook almost from the start, 7 or 8 years ago, that far back, had routes of appeals internally. And so they would go up from external, the first person to make the judgment, to say somewhere in Menlo Park would ultimately be the final. Setting up the Oversight Board was an idea, kind of like a Supreme Court in part, to have a set of rules, and then a group of people would working really 5 at a time in panels, would make decisions about Facebook's decisions. And the most famous one maybe was the Donald Trump's banning on January 6th, late in the day, January 6, 2020. So you would they made a decision, the board decided one way or the other, and if Facebook is overturned, as they are about 70% of the time so far, they have to change that decision and presumably change similar decisions. As we've gotten into the work, the somewhat more important, I would think, certainly equally important, maybe more important, has been policy advice. Policy advice is not obligatory. Facebook has to respond to it. They pose questions. For example, right now, most recently, they posed the question about changing their policies toward COVID and about the takedown policies, about essentially information is judged false and whether it should be taken down or lighter touch should be taken and so on. So essentially, they were asking us, intentionally or not, for a full-scale look at their work in the COVID area. And I think that's going to be very interesting. And it's an attempt, given that everybody on the board actually is not does not answer to Mark Zuckerberg or to Facebook. And indeed, actually, the odd thing about it is that almost no non-formal, informal contacts with Facebook employees. So it is a kind of internal, external thing. I think I've been pleased so far with the free speech credentials and commitments of my fellow colleagues, and I think that will continue. I would say the other thing is that it sounds like something Facebook would say, right? Which is that the cases we have, but also the jobs they deal with, are incredibly complex and difficult. And I think Christine was somewhat getting at this. I just wonder if they can do the job, that anybody on earth can do the job, right? Again, these people are reviewing 100 million posts per day. And that's just like an abstract number, right? But then you start thinking about it. When we look at these cases and we look at a takedown, we spend maybe too much time, but we spend a bunch of time on it and get into it and find out who did it and why. These decisions are made by machines, and if they're appealed by humans, the appeals are done mostly in a few minutes somewhere throughout the world. There's going to be errors, but what we have done is create a worldwide platform that has pretty much instantaneous virality and a set of rules that are just, it's very difficult at this stage to get it all together in ways that's not going to cause problems or cause unhappiness. I think the other thing I would say is I like Facebook, apart from my work there. I think what we've forgotten, and because Facebook is correct, the external problems of society are some of the problems that they have to face. And I think we forget, and conservatives in particular forget, what the world was like before social media, right? If as long as you stay, when very proud, conservatives have got access to each other and to a public audience in the United States that they never had. I grew up with Dan Rather, folks, right? I grew up with Walter Cronkite sort of saying whatever. Now, all of that was fine, and it was certainly well within First Amendment tradition. But there's a lot more diversity, and we need to focus on the issues and give informed commentary that makes things better, constructive. But also, don't forget, at least for Meta, and I guess I would say also YouTube, this has been a great boon for conservatives, and the net balance is strongly in favor of benefits. And we don't want to do something that, in pursuit of trying to deal with real issues, we threaten those benefits for anyone, but especially those who have benefited the way the right has.
Let's open things up. Are there, to begin with, some questions here in the room? Yeah, let's start right there in the middle. Please tell us who you are and a quick question.
Yeah, my name is Bonnie Wachtel. We started the discussion with the comment that there's no systematic bias against conservatives, therefore suggesting the problem is just hallucinatory, for example, for conservatives. But I think when you have the very central, key, important issues that were brought up by Mr. Swanson regarding COVID, climate, the election, Hunter Biden, it isn't necessary to look at a systemic problem. It's obvious you've got a very deep problem with respect to Facebook and Twitter simply pursuing and amplifying government propaganda. And I say propaganda because we now have very clear evidence that the government was reaching out to places like Facebook, telling them to pull people like guys like Alex Berenson off and label them. In this respect, I'd have to say Facebook and Twitter are in a war with truth itself. And the idea that they're adopting positions from the government in no way makes this better. Just one more example in addition to those we heard from the panel. Merrick Garland apparently thinks that parents objecting to school curriculum at a PTA meeting is domestic terrorism. And now we have feedback from a number of FBI agents of how they're coerced into presenting this. I mean, it really is a fever swamp. So putting that as my predicate, and I'd have to say, I don't think you've answered any of those objections other than that there is some mild attempt to backtrack. Let me make the following suggestions, which I don't know if they'll react, but I put them out for what they are. Number one is, I'm very concerned about this oversight board, a board that gives the appearance of being reasonable when it's obvious they have just tremendous failures at the highest level in terms of actually letting a debate about truth go forward. I do remember when that was set up, the woman who was at the head of the Heritage Institute, an African-American woman, was on the board. She was forced off. And I have to question what sort of balance is on that board. That's one good item you could take back to your colleagues to present. And the other is, maybe we just need truth in labeling. I mean, in the world of newspapers where you have some that are progressive and some that are conservative, you don't need to have a statement on every page saying, you know, these are all just the viewpoints and opinions of the owners or the editorial directors of this newspaper. But in a case where you have barriers to entry, maybe that would work. Essentially put up a sign saying, don't pay any attention to this or to our labels about misinformation or violence or the rest of it. That's just our opinion. All right, thank you.
Christine, please.
Okay, well, first of all, as those of you who know me can attest, you'll meet no one more skeptical and nearly conspiratorial when it comes to Facebook and its motives. But I have to say, on the oversight board question, I have to disagree with you strongly because I think they really did make an effort. And the K situation was a separate thing, but the fact that John alone, if John was the only person I saw on that board who I could trust, I would say that's a good sign. But there are many others who are doing very good work on it. I think they really did try to find a balance among not just conservatives, but also libertarians and people from with economics backgrounds. They did try to make a good board. Is it perfect? Of course not, but it's the first iteration of something that hopefully will become a kind of accountability institution. I agree with you're very passionate about the examples you gave, and I have followed each of them in turn, and the frustration you express is, I think, completely legitimate. I would question whether, and I think this is where I become frustrated as well. The platforms claim that they can solve that frustration problem with moderation, right? And that's why we're here sitting talking about whether moderation is actually possible. But in fact, those are people problems. Some of the things these are human nature problems. And we are unfortunately spending, and this is why when I said Facebook shouldn't be, Facebook, Twitter, all of these places should not be considered a public square, I would say it's better, and this is where your caveat emptor suggestion is a good one, think of them as a performance space, right? It's a theater, it's a stage. And we can all come in there and we can perform whatever we want. You can do music, you can do screaming at someone who you disagree with politically, but it's a stage. Now the stage manager will come in and kick off the guy who claims he's gonna immolate himself for a political statement, because their insurance doesn't cover that, right? Like they're gonna hustle him off stage. But there's a way of thinking about these platforms that is not civic, and that's where I really get stuck with the use of civic language, because I think it gets us into these discussions of you're harming us in a way that a citizen has a right to argue about and to claim rights about. We don't have those rights on these platforms because that's not the spaces they are. But I agree that, like, I think anyone who uses a social media platform should assume buyer beware, because you're the product. You're not even, I mean, you should never click on a single thing on these platforms without realizing that that's square one that you're starting from. And that's why I don't think they're civic spaces.
Brett, please.
Just briefly wanted to emphasize one of your points, which is that in the last 6 weeks, we've had a flood, hundreds and hundreds of pages of FOIA documents showing that dozens of federal employees at dozens of federal agencies have either directed or cooperated with the firms to specify takedowns and what you might call censorship. And so that has added that has taken this debate to another level, where the last couple of years that was a question. Now I think we know that there are some, to me, obvious looking First Amendment issues here.
John, is the performance space metaphor right for you?
Well, the way politics is going, that's not going to exclude a civic space, is it? Because it's very clear that much of our politics is performative, right? I want to go to the question that Brett has mentioned and is implicit in the question here, because I've read as many of those transcripts as I could find, and Brett actually, rightly in an earlier exchange, prompted me to do so. And what I have found so far, and I'll be happy to learn more about it if someone is mostly discussions about the Facebook. First of all, it's not the government going to Facebook, it's Facebook going to the government and trying to find out asking them for new kinds of really anti-vax material. So I learned a great deal about that I didn't know about, sort of heard about vaccinations making you magnetic, including an interesting photo of a man with forks attached to him that had appeared on Facebook. I learned a great deal about Bill Gates that I didn't know about, including involved microchips and the vaccine and his commitment to depopulation, all of which are apparently tied together. What I didn't find out, I didn't come across the Great Barrington Declaration being taken down, or whomever, the reasonable sorts of arguments. Now, they may be in there. I don't know that. My job is to be skeptical about this. But what I found was that this kind of, so far, I mean, I do. One of the problems is finding these catches. There's the Missouri Senate candidate that has posted some of them, as well as the Washington Examiner has posted some. What I haven't found in going through them yet is anything other than they seeking out information about the craziest kind of discussions. That, remember, the rule is at Facebook is an incitement rule, right? In a pandemic, if you tell people not to get vaccinated, you are doing direct physical harm to someone, likely to people that would then get the virus. And not only the people that believe the vaccination stuff, but third parties that may not be vaccinated, that would get the virus from them. So it's not just a million world in which people have to assume their own interests and their own level of risk. You also have externalities at issue. I'd like to say something about Hunter Biden, because I think the Hunter Biden case is actually the one that probably lingers in people's minds. You recall it was essentially at Facebook and others, it was essentially efforts to make it harder to hear about Hunter Biden's computer and what was on it. But again, so often in the internet and social media, you really need context. Let's go back to 2016 in November, when it was said very broadly that Facebook had essentially elected Donald Trump by allowing the Russians to buy a bunch of ads. You may recall that. It was ludicrous at the time, and Mark Zuckerberg said so and got his head handed to him for saying so, not by anybody in the room, I think, but by the usual suspect. Flash forward 4 years, it's 3 weeks before the election, and there's standing around Facebook trying to get through the election, and suddenly the FBI gives you notice that, here's something's coming. Oh, okay. Well, and immediately a bunch of elite people say, well, this is a Russian misinformation. So now be Mark Zuckerberg, late October 2020. Your choice is as follows. I cut off the information about it, and I get blamed for making Biden president and intervening in the election. On the other hand, if I let it go through and everyone can talk about it, it's going to be Trump wins re-election. I have for a second time re-elected Trump, and now on top of that, I'm a traitor, and the company is a bunch of traitors. Now, that's the way he saw the world, I believe. I don't know that, but I believe that. Now you decide. What do you do if you were Mark Zuckerberg in those circumstances? We pretend that these are just kind of Manichaean battles of good and evil. Politicians are trying to force these people into circumstances they want them to be in because there's a lot at stake. And that's the problem. There's a lot at stake, I think, and it causes a lot of problems for the social media companies. Some companies don't do much of an effort to be neutral or balanced. We know who those are. But I think a lot of stuff that happens, you need to understand the context.
Well, we're almost out of time. We've got time for just one last thought here. Maybe the question to end with is, John has suggested that whatever we think should happen, and that's what we've been talking about, what will happen is nothing. I wonder if he has more to say about that, but first of all, if the two of you agree with that. Brett, do you think that where we're headed as a policy matter is basically status quo?
Well, I think one way or another, we're probably, at least in the legal realm, in the courts, we're going to see something, right? We've got these two divergent opinions from the Fifth and the 11th Circuits, as John mentioned. So that's coming. Clarence Thomas, for the last number of years, has hinted that he would like the courts to weigh on this question, because there's really never been a firm decision about what, for example, Section 230 really means. It's never certainly been tested at the Supreme Court like this. And so in that way, I think we're definitely going to see something. I couldn't predict now what that will look like. In the policy arena, I think there's probably less likelihood that we're going to see something distinct in the near term. These issues are just too complicated, and every time something looks like it's getting a little momentum, it gets sidetracked. For example, the newspaper Senator Klobuchar bill, which now seems to have been sidetracked. That's only a small part of this debate. But I would say for now it's in the courts.
There's also some interesting and creative stuff being done at the state level, right? So California just has this law about, protecting design choices that would protect children when it comes to technology. It's a little vague even for my taste, and I'm a fan of like protecting children, as I think most Americans are, although not really. Some people argue about that. But I do think that we should look at the state level and look at some of the pieces of legislation that they're considering. I agree that it's going to end up having to go to the Supreme Court. But I also think, and this is where I'm a little bit more pessimistic, I think we're going to keep seeing the social media platforms pursue the sort of noble lie strategy, which is, and this is bipartisan, because if a Republican was in office, they're going to put the same exact pressure on these platforms as the Democratic administration is doing now, because it's about power. It's really not about whether you have an R or a D after your name. And even with the ideological monoculture in Silicon Valley, that pressure is going to be brought to bear by a Republican as much as by a Democrat. I worry that that becomes more of a discussion about populism and elitism, and whether the companies see themselves as a vanguard of an elite that protects people from themselves and from ideas that might be harmful for them. And that concern, I think, is going to be an ongoing struggle when it comes to what these platforms can moderate.
John, a final word. Do you agree that the courts are going to force some kind of action, one direction or another?
Certainly, they're going. Those two conflicting decisions are going to the court. So yes, we would get a decision that way. And so I was thinking about the national level and the National Congress because I've worked in Washington all my life. But you could have the Florida or the Texas social media bill could become good law if the court comes down on their side. Now, what that would mean for the network itself, for the internet, for social media would be quite interesting because you could go to Texas and stay in Washington. Your body could stay in Washington, your computer go to Texas, and you could have a different set of rules. It could be the actual Wild West again in ways that we might not like. It might like, both of it. But that I would see as the biggest issue, yeah. Otherwise, I think the companies themselves will remain the big policymakers and will be they will, they're trying to get politicians. It's like television in 1969. What does this mean? Oh my God, it could affect my re-election chances. It could affect the outcomes for the party. So they're going to be squeezing if they can. And that's, I think that's an argument for editorial rights. It really is. You want somebody independent of the government. The choice is not good guys necessarily with the Government Act. So,
well, thank you very much. We're going to take a quick break here and then head into our second panel, but please help me to thank our panel, and thanks for the conversation.
Just a word before we begin this panel. As I mentioned at the outset, a number of the papers in this series already appear on the website platforms.aei.org. Not all of them yet. Some are forthcoming, and we've already heard from a couple of the authors. I just want to point out two papers in particular that are relevant to the first conversation that we had. The first is by Professor Richard Epstein of NYU and the Hoover Institution. He wrote his paper on the social media platforms and whether they should be treated as common carriers under the law, obviously now an issue of real legal significance. His answer in the title of the paper is, "It depends," so you have to read the paper. And a second paper relevant to the first panel is by Alex Fierst. Alex he's currently at Murmuration Labs. Before that, he was general counsel at Neuralink and also at Medium.com, the publishing platform. And his paper, which also has already been published in the series, is on artificial intelligence and its role in content moderation. So I hope you'll look at both of those papers. So now we're turning in the second conversation from looking primarily at the platforms themselves to now looking at government and governing institutions that are relevant to the platforms. The title of the panel is "The Challenge of Regulating in an Era of Transformative Innovation." Three more authors, and I'll give their introductions one at a time when it's each person's turn to speak. We're going to begin with Adam Thierer. Adam is a technology policy analyst, most recently at the Mercatus Center, and the author of an excellent book, Permissionless Innovation. He's also written great papers, on a number of subjects, but particularly on the subject of soft law, which I've learned a lot from in my own work on administrative law. His paper in this series is titled Governing Emerging Technology in an Age of Policy Fragmentation and Disequilibrium. I don't think we did search engine optimization on that, but Adam, why don't you kick us off with your paper?
Well, thank you, Adam, and thanks to you and to AEI and the Knight Foundation for sponsoring this series of papers. I've learned a lot from it already. You mentioned the Alex Fierst study. I thought that was really outstanding. I'm sorry he couldn't be here today, but I wrote a whole piece about his paper.
Yes.
And how important it was. Just my title of mine was like, "There's no Goldilocks formula for content moderation in social media or the metaverse." And he raises a lot of the really interesting challenges associated with algorithmic decision making in terms of content moderation. So I highly recommend that paper among the many others. So my paper was an attempt to basically summarize a lot of work that I've been doing over the last decade. A lot of it was for the Mercatus Center. A lot of it was for the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State University, who contracted with me through Gary Marchant's program there, which is one of the best technology policy programs in America. Does a lot of really good work on technological governance. They contracted a couple of law review articles and other papers from me. And it was an attempt to try to come to grips with the evolution of emerging technology law in the United States and the world. But really a big focus here domestically on what is happening in terms of where the rubber hits the road and like the day-to-day on-the-ground management or governance of a variety of emerging technology sectors. And I begin with sort of an admission that like everything I'm going to say is suboptimal and makes everyone angry. I'm dealing in the realm of sort of radical pragmatism, if you will, about the way technological governance is playing out today. People on the left clamoring for a lot more regulation. People on the right want more clarity, less agency discretion. And yet we can't seem to have anybody get what they want. There's a lot of second best solutions that are emerging, and some of them go by the name of soft law or decentralized governance. Before I get to a more specific discussion of what we mean by these terms, I think it's important to step back and acknowledge sort of a couple of key realities to why we're here today talking about this sort of new world of technological governance and how it's messy and unsatisfying. The first is a set of technological realities that are undeniable and quite difficult for Congress and all policymakers to deal with. Beginning with the fact that we live in a world of combinatorial innovation, or what the scholar Carlota Perez calls concurrent technological revolutions. Just sort of like compounding, cascading waves of technological change coming one on top of another, just cresting and crashing repeatedly, making it very, very difficult for policymakers and regulators to get on top of something, get up a learning curve, and really master it before another thing comes along that they have to come to grips with. And of course, this is also driven by the so-called pacing problem, the fact that technological change evolves very, very rapidly, sometimes exponentially, but the pace of policy change tends to be incremental. And the problem is the gap between these things is growing every single year. That's the so-called pacing problem, sometimes also called the exponential gap, or the law of disruption. Larry Downs uses that term. So those are the technological realities, and that's making life very, very difficult for technological policymakers. And then you have sort of political realities, things that are uncomfortable to talk about, which is, the incredible, just sort of grotesque dysfunctionalism of our congressional body, right? I mean, the inability to move legislation in a bipartisan way on a lot of issues, but especially more technical matters. It's been a long time since we've had a broad-based sort of emerging technology consensus on much of anything. I worked very actively when I was at the Heritage Foundation for 10 years on the Telecommunications Act, and even before that, the Cable Act and other things. You just don't get too many things like that anymore. In my own lifetime, I'd have to go all the way back to the late 70s to find an example of sort of sweeping deregulation or agency abolition in the form of like the Civil Aeronautics Board being abolished and all airline regulation being eliminated by Alfred Kahn and congressional Democrats. That just doesn't happen much anymore. And so we live in a world where you have a lot of, Steve Tellis uses this term, kludgeocracy, where you have policymakers, but especially regulators and administrative agencies, sort of like kludging together, bringing together a hodgepodge of makeshift rules and an ad hoc, very unsatisfactory basis to try to figure out how to just make things work, sort of sticking gums, on the cracks of everything to make sure the structure doesn't fall over. And this is because Congress just continues to delegate more and more authority, a passing of the buck, if you will, to regulatory agencies in the administrative state, and just expecting them to figure these things out. But increasingly they can't because of those other technological realities. And so we get to the world that we know today for emerging tech, which is one where we have this so-called body of soft law, which is a variety of types of informal governance mechanisms, which can include everything from agency recommended best practices, agency workshops and reports, consultation, multi-stakeholder processes are all the rage today, informal awareness building efforts, educational remedies, experimental sandboxes, like a little temporary zone of freedom to go out and experiment, sort of what the Brits call trialing, or what Attorney General Weiser of Colorado once referred to as entrepreneurial administration, sort of creative experiments by policymakers. And this body of sort of soft law mechanisms, it operates in the shadow of hard law, and there's a lot of hard law. We heard John mention in the previous panel a lot of jawboning and nudging going on that I think makes a lot of conservatives, quite rightly, very uncomfortable because of the potential for abuse here. In the old days, when I used to cover FCC policy, the term of art we used to use for this was regulation by raised eyebrow, because the regulators knew that they couldn't directly censor broadcast television radio stations, so they would just call in executives and say, you're going to put what on the air tonight? And all of a sudden it wouldn't be on the air tonight. And then that sort of nudging is really a form of indirect censorship. And so this is a really unsatisfactory kind of world we live in, but I find that there's actually some benefits to it. And I think, rightly or wrongly, I've sort of been accused of being sort of an apologist for soft law among some of my friends and enemies, and I will say guilty as charged. Because at the end of the day, you've got to get things done. You've got to kind of come up with rough and ready consensus and sort of governance frameworks or visions for how we're going to move things along if the technological realities are what they are, and if the congressional dysfunctionalism doesn't change. Let me just use a case study very briefly that I developed in the paper around autonomous vehicles, driverless cars, something I've spent a lot of time writing about in journal articles and papers. For the last 8 years, we've heard in every single session of Congress, this is the year we're going to get driverless car legislation. And there's a lot of consensus that we need it. I think we need it. We need a national framework for autonomous vehicles, for AVs. Really, it comes down to the fact that the trial lawyers and Teamsters don't want it, and so we don't get it, even though there's a lot of Republicans and Democrats willing to come together and work together on this. And so what fills the gap? Well, there are some state-level efforts. There are some state DMVs and laws that do pass, but really what's filled the gap is soft law. And so over the course now of 3 presidential administrations, beginning with the Obama administration, continuing on during President Trump, and then even in Joe Biden's presidency, we have witnessed the Department of Transportation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration develop a body of best practices and guidance documents that are even versioned like software. They call them Autonomous Vehicles Policy 3.0, 4.0. That's where we're at now, 4.0. By the way, we've had 4 versions of this. And in fact, one of these presentations, or one of these guidance documents was a PowerPoint presentation that was undated. So that's how informal our governance has gotten for emerging tech today. In one of the most interesting experiences I've ever had in my life, I went in to meet with about a dozen Trump administration officials at the DOT who had just come out with version 3.0 a few years back. And I was praising them and saying, this is really great stuff. You know, you've given us a good framework for all of this, and I think this kind of soft law framework is great. And they're like, but this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing things this way. We don't like it. Grumble, grumble, grumble. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not that bad. And what do you want? Well, Congress needs to pass legislation. We need to get a better. I'm like, I agree. But what's our second best solution? And they had come up with it, but they just didn't want to kind of come to grips with it. But that's the world we live in. And so in my paper, I go through all of these other examples, and I've documented them in much, much more detail in my law review articles, of where soft law has unfolded through Federal Trade Commission, Consumer Product Safety Commission, NTIA has been big on this. FDA has been huge on this. We've had for soft law frameworks for the governance of connected medical devices, for drones, for cybersecurity and connected vehicles, the Internet of Things, online advertising practices, 3D printed devices. We do not have formal hard law for any of these things. But what we do have is rough rules of the road that are more in the form of like, you should consider, or you might want to, as opposed to you must or you shall. In fact, this made things very hard for my former colleagues at Mercatus, who I used to work with, when they went to measure like regulatory burdens, because we were using metadata searches that looked for terms like must and shall, and all of a sudden they were gone. Now, I'll again recall what I've already said, that this should make a lot of more conservative types very uncomfortable, because we're talking about something that in a sense is a betrayal of the rule of law. And it is not by the books. And there's been a huge amount of literature written, including by people to the left of center, about the problems of delegation, the problem of administrative state abuse, and so on and so forth, and the problems of nudging. I have an entire chapter for a book on the problems of nudging in this space. But what do you want to do about it? Do you want to just raise your hands up and say, we're not going to do anything now? We'll just give it up? We just need to pass that law, darn it. Well, I'm now in the world of radical pragmatism where I say, I'm going to help. I'm going to try to figure out rough and ready governance solutions. In the context of internet, we used to have this wonderful phrase for internet management called running code and rough consensus. Basically, try to find a way to continue to iterate and find agile governance solutions and work together to build consensus around difficult problems and then muddle through. And it's worked fairly well, not perfectly well, to address a lot of things in the internet governance space. I think that is ultimately, whether we like it or not, going to be the way a lot of our modern emerging technologies are governed. I also walked through a case study of how this is already playing out for social media, but our first panel and panelists did a wonderful job discussing that. We're muddling through there as well. There's no Goldilocks formula, there's no silver bullet solution, just a lot of ad hoc kind of solutions we're cobbling together. So I know I've probably gone over my initial time here, but I'll just say this. The one other thing I do develop in my paper for AI is a discussion of how this exact same phenomenon is playing out overseas, specifically in the UK. Post-Brexit, they are doing really innovative things in the UK to come up with creative solutions to these hard governance questions for emerging technologies. And so I run through a variety of reports where they're talking about the need for some better type of, I got the phrase here, I love this, test and evolve rather than solve and leave. And I love that because I often criticize set it and forget it regulation. There was an amazing study by Deloitte a few years back that in 2017 surveyed the entire US Code of Regulations and found that 85% of rules in the CFR had either never been revised or only revised once. 65% of them never revised in the entire history of the CFR. That's set it and forget it kind of regulation. And this is why regulation breaks down. It is just not consistent with modern technological realities. In light of that, you have to come up with some other rough and ready solutions, running code and rough consensus, whatever you want to call it. And so I think I'll leave it there because I want to leave some time for discussions, but I have also developed in that paper and then in my next book, a whole discussion about how this is about to become the new normal for the field of algorithmic regulation and AI. This is becoming the norm there as well, and we're about to see it take over, but we're going to see this clash of the old sort of precautionary principle model versus this more agile governance model for technology in the field of AI and algorithms. Great. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Adam. In addition to being the first speaker today, I should note his paper was the first out in the series. And so again, you can find it on the website. Next, we're going to go with Zach Graves. Zach is Executive Director of the Lincoln Network. Previously, he founded the R Street Institute's Department on Technology and Innovation. Additionally, he's a member of the Polaris Council, an advisory board for science and technology at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And his forthcoming paper for this series focuses on American innovation and the governance of the future. Zach?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think this idea of like what our governing institutions do and react to technology is a really key one. I think it's important to sort of ground that in some context about the evolution of the American tech sector. I mean, clearly over the last 50 or more years, like, technology has been a huge driver of technological progress and economic growth, raising the standard of living for Americans. And you can see really easy evidence of this in that US tech firms dominate the list of top companies by market cap, that we're still producing more unicorns, that is like companies worth $1 billion or more than anywhere else in the world, even China, which there are reasons to be skeptical of where they're going now. And really this is rooted in an interesting history. There's this mythology that I talk about in the paper of the sort of mythical American lone inventor, and to some extent that was true in its history, but really I would say like the key figure is the founder. It's not just the sort of invention in a garage, but it's the sort of commercialization, and increasingly the trajectory of that has been a kind of a bureaucratization, supported through not just the sort of flash of genius of the inventor, but also sort of institutions and systems that support that, including ones related to the federal government, which I think maybe some of our right-leaning friends might be a little uneasy about. But it's really kind of coming out of the post-World War II big science and big government that we've helped support Silicon Valley and the big firms and entrepreneurs that we have today. This is in partnership with things like the Apollo program, DoD appropriation, DoD acquisitions. The ICBMs and Apollo program were essential to building the semiconductor industry, and we continue to spend, $140 billion a year in R&D. The tech that comes out of universities in basic and applied science helps to kind of support this. But increasingly the trajectory of that has also been one of sort of soft tech, and I think it's really important, something I talk about in the paper, is sort of consumer devices and soft tech raise a very different set of problems than those in hard tech. I mean, the big harms and risks have tended to be from more industrial processes, from nuclear power, synthetic production of ammonia, things that are in a very different realm and I think should be treated quite differently. And traditionally, I think these, this intersection has been one dominated by executive branch governance in U.S. history. And Congress has, as an institution, I think, deserves some of the criticism it gets for its failures to adapt, but also I think some of the critiques of it and the narratives of its dysfunction are wrong. One, I think, is this expectation that it has the sort of top-down sovereignty model of the executive branch or the CEO, where it'll work immediately in response to a crisis. But in reality, it's a deliberative body. It functions, mitigating the different concerns of factions and parochial interests, and it moves by design, quite a lot slower than the executive branch. The existence of the need for cloture to surpass a 60-vote threshold is something that prevents massive policy swings between elections, and you can argue about whether that's a good thing or not, but that was, I think, quite deliberate in the structure of how that governance model works. I want to talk about a couple anecdotes, too, of Congress that have gotten, most recently, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, was dragged before Congress to testify, a couple times now. And, a clip that was pulled out of that as sort of evidence for this, total, dysfunction of Congress is, he told Senator Orrin Hatch, in response to a question about their business model, Senator, we run ads, and this was a sort of a gotcha moment. Another example of this came, maybe a decade earlier, when Senator Ted Stevens famously was talking about, a series of tubes as an analogy, for, basically bandwidth limitations on the internet, and whether the debate was about essentially net neutrality, right? Whether how this is monetized if you're using a lot of online bandwidth, like a Netflix or a streaming service. So I think both of those quotes actually make quite a lot of sense in context. The first was a rhetorical question. The second is a clumsy, but I think defensible analogy. And so, nonetheless, though, I think there are, as Adam said, lots of examples of places where we'd like to see more congressional action doing positive regulatory frameworks in areas of emerging technologies, responding to harms and risks. But even in recent decades, the big areas where they've done legislation have taken quite a while. I think you referenced the '96 Telecom Act update. If I recall, it took nearly a decade in debate and discussion leading up to it. I think it's true that Congress does less reauthorization of agencies and programs than it used to, but it still does a number of things every year or every few years that are very important. Funding bills are one, and particularly directing support for that kind of basic and applied research is a key component of that. And some of that stuff is very important to emerging technologies. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, now DARPA, was really critical to creating the internet and GPS and a number of technologies that have made their way and become commercialized in our smartphones and in other things that power this segment of the innovation economy. And so, they also do, the NDAA, another really important vehicle every year. And periodically, there are, still reauthorizations of FAA. That's coming up next year. There was, I think, a lot of great work from Adam's former institution, the Mercatus Center, in enabling supersonic flight, which is really exciting and an area of hard tech that we look to that was a thing done by Congress. And I don't really think, I think soft law is, essential. And muddling through, I think, shouldn't be, written off. I think this is largely how we've done it and how we've balanced these competing factions and opposition to technology, which is something I talk about in the paper, is structurally built into the creative destruction of innovation. I think capitalist liberal democracies are really the best solution to that, even if they're kludgy and require muddling through. But I think there are things that just like you need Congress to be a functional institution to do. That you can't escape this. That you can get your way through to some extent on multi-stakeholder bodies, on the courts and the common law and agencies, but ultimately you still will eventually need congressional action in a number of these areas, which I talk about at length in the paper. But I think there are also cycles of congressional reassertion and decline, and I think we are coming out of one where we were at the nadir of that decline, and I think there are some good reasons to be optimistic about revitalizing that institutional capacity. But I think thinking about this, it's really important to understand why the institution is dysfunctional and what led to that. One key reason, I think, is the centralization of power that we've seen in the institution, moving away from the committee era, starting around the mid to late 1970s to present. A lot of power has been concentrated in leadership. Staff and leadership offices in Congress have grown tremendously, while committees and personal offices and support agencies have declined significantly. Often this is sort of pointed to having a big inflection point after the Republican Revolution. I know you've all, who was on the previous panel, experienced that and probably has some thoughts on it as well. But this is also a key moment for the formation of science and technology policy in particular, since it entailed the defunding of an internal think tank within Congress called the Office of Technology Assessment, which provided a really, I think, strong model for giving Congress sort of foresight and insight from a multidisciplinary perspective about emerging technologies, and did so in a uniquely democratic context that I think is a function that is really essential for the institution, and now has been restarted in another agency, the Government Accountability Office, which I think you mentioned in my bio. And so they're working to sort of rebuild this capacity for policy formation. But it's not sufficient to have expertise. You can lead a horse to water, you can't force them to drink. And the political incentives and dynamics in Congress have changed quite significantly. And there's also a lack of capacity to absorb this kind of expertise. As I mentioned, committees have declined, nearly, 40% from about 96 to 2020 or so. And that's pretty significant. We've seen in the last appropriations bill an increase for that. But even so, the policy resources in Congress, the expert staff, their seniority has really declined and needs to be rebuilt. And this is really the product of decades of self-imposed cuts, austerity, enfeeblement, things that have been pushed by the conservative think tank and activist class, really coming out of, I think, that Republican Revolution, where they're running against 40 years of democratic control, saying that we need to come in and clean house and eliminate waste, and we need to reassert ourselves. And so this is an anti-institutional posture that I don't think is rooted in any particular conservative principle. I think it's just one of short-term politics that has persisted, and now I think is weakening as you have sort of turnover and retirements and changes. And I think there's an increasing bipartisan recognition that building up this institution is important. I think AEI has been one of the leaders in that, but you've also seen groups like the Cato Institute, where I used to work, Adam used to be at as well. That if you look at their handbook for policymakers in Congress in the mid-90s, it's very much cut this to the bone. And now, if you look at the work product they're putting out, we need to reinvest in institutional capacity here. And so I think we're really seeing an important shift in those narratives. In the last two Congresses, there's also been this effort called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress in the House that's been really successful, really focused on incremental technocratic improvements, but I think they've gone a long way to restoring some of that capability to form policy, even about really complex technical issues. So I think pushing that continuing to push that kind of capacity building can help create a restoration and revitalization of the institution, which is something we've seen in the past. While the overwhelming modern trajectory has been an increase in executive power, most often coming out of big wars and crises, there's also been things like the Legislative Reorganization Act. There's one in the 40s, one in 1970. And these really bolstered the institution. I think there is an opportunity to do that again that will be really essential to continue America's leadership in emerging technologies in the future. And I don't think we can do it without having well-functioning governance institutions. I think soft law is also an important part, but I think we can't do it without having a strong legislature because of the core. The core difference of that is that it is closer to the people. It is more accountable. It is a place where different values can be tested against each other, and trade-offs can be negotiated. That doesn't, the policy cannot form that way in an executive branch context or in an agency context. There's risks of capture. There's a lot of reasons why I think we need to build that capacity again in that institution. And so, my takeaway from that, I think, would be, thinking about institutional incentives and capacity is something we'll have to tackle. And so, I think it's inevitable that we need to think hard and work in a bipartisan way to rebuild not just sort of second best solutions, but also the core institutions of governance and bring them into the 21st century.
Well, thanks, Zach. And we will circle back to Congress. As you mentioned, AEI has focused a lot on institutional reform of Congress. We'll take your theory of Congress to be it's only up from here. But I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more about Congress after this. Now, in addition to focusing on governing institutions for domestic policy, one of the discussions that we organized for the series was on the United States' role in international discussions on policy and the different ways in which the United States and the global community have approached some of these issues. For example, one of the papers already posted is by Shane Greenstein of the Harvard Business School, focused on the U.S. approach to antitrust policy on these issues relative to other countries. And on this point, I want to turn now to our third speaker. It's Johannes Bauer, who also took a look at the United States and the international community. Johannes is the Quello Chair in Media and Information Policy at Michigan State University's College of Communication Arts and Sciences. He researches and writes on the digital economy and next generation media. He's co-edited many books on innovation and governance, including the Handbook on the the Handbook on the Economics of the Internet, and his forthcoming paper for this series focuses on U.S. global leadership in platform policy. Johannes, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. It's a great pleasure to be here. And the risk of going third is, of course, that all the points that you had in your notes were already made by the previous speakers, right, and great minds before me. So I'm going to go a little bit off script here, and I'm also going to go a little bit off the paper that I'm actually developing, and we'll come back to this.
The paper was fine, just to be clear.
Pardon?
The paper was fine.
Yeah, to this issue of U.S. leadership. But let me start by telling you a little bit where I'm coming from, because I mean, Adam and Zach, known quantities, I think, here in Washington, D.C. I'm less of a known quantity. I'm actually an economist from Austria, but I'm not necessarily an Austrian economist. I think that Schumpeter is a great thinker, so is Hayek, or Mises for that matter, and others. And I really learn a lot from their ideas, but I think there's also limitations to what they can tell us. Secondly, I'm a passionate hiker, and I like sort of the used metaphors of landscapes. And currently, as Adam said before, right, the challenge is not necessarily that we have failing institutions, but I think we have a mismatch between the way our institutions work and the landscape that they need to navigate, the technological landscape, the competitive landscape. Already lots of details were shared. There's one other aspect, I think, that has not been mentioned and really needs to be considered. That's we are increasingly working in a set of technologies and in economic processes that are interdependent, where an increasing number of players beyond the borders of what can be controlled by the US government or by a state government influence what's happening. So that landscape continues to be shifting. And it's easy to point fingers to institutional failure, to policy failure, but unless we also see that the structure of the problem has really radically changed, we will not come up with the right solutions. I've written on Agile Regulation, and I think it's a great tool, or in general, soft law regulation going forward. I also agree with Zach that we need sort of to think about the institutional fabric, both at the level of that agility, but we also need to have a broader sort of guardrails that sort of constrain agility. And to do this well, I think we need to understand when should policy intervene in this new system. And I'm afraid that we use the wrong compass. A lot of our thinking is still based in imagining the world as a world of industrial mechanical technology. And, but we are in a world where the systems that we're talking about are more dynamic. They might even be complex. I'm not completely sure, but I agree that everything is complex. It's complicated, but it's dynamic, certainly. And in order to understand when does policy intervention make sense in those systems, I think we have to have a more robust theory and a more robust framework to identify when we should intervene. I'm like others. I'm concerned about the power of platforms. I'm concerned as an economist. I'm concerned as a citizen. But I'm also concerned that government intervention based on the old compass will lead to the wrong outcomes. And let me just give you an example right away. Right? We use old analogies and old tools. So for example, in the telephone industry, number portability worked really well. And it helped sort of facilitate competition in that space. But if we use the same analogy and say data portability now is going to work in this new digital environment, I think we have to think twice, right? Because data portability has a number of unexpected consequences. And I think we're missing the question that we could ask is, are there other tools that we could use that achieve the same set of purposes? So for example, a proposal that is out there among people in the academy and others would be in situ data access, for example, which has many more beneficial properties than data portability has. And we can talk more about this. But how then would we shape our intellectual framework, right? I mean, agility is great, but if I'm like an agile hiker, walk up a little hill, I end up being on a little hill. I need to understand how does the bigger landscape look like, right? And for this, we need some better theory. And what I would propose here to kick this off is we need, first of all, a dynamic theory of competition and of innovation. And one important component of it will be, as Adam already said, a combinatorial theory of innovation. I think combinatorial innovation means that innovation is essentially a process whereby we combine information into new knowledge. Right? And as the base of knowledge grows, the number of combinatorial options grows too. Right? And one of the reasons why it's so difficult to find the right policy nowadays is that that space is incredibly complicated. It's vast, and it's very difficult to come up with the right policy going forward. Right? So agility may be one response to it, but I think we need more, and we need sort of that broader sort of guardrails. How can we do this? I don't want to go into the details. The paper discusses this in more detail, but we have the models actually to think through this. And one of the building blocks is the theory of complementary innovation. And that goes back to work that was done in the late 1990s, maybe before even, but it was formalized then, right? Where we better understand how those systems that have multiple layers, where you have interdependencies between those layers, really work. So for example, a system where you have an infrastructure platform on which other players then operate. And we do know that in such combinatorial systems and so complementary systems, that there are interdependencies that actually frequently align the interests of players with each other. So the platform understands that it needs the complementary types of innovators. Right? The platform understands that if the platform is too tight and too closed, that complementary innovation system will suffer. Likewise, the complementors know that they need the platform. And then if the system is aligned well, we have a synergistic feedback loop that really leads to ever better and ever more effective innovation in that space. And so the question for policymakers then is, when does that synergistic feedback loop not work, right? And what are the conditions when we then perhaps have reasons to intervene? And once we see those, how do we do it? Let me give you a couple of examples when this might be the case. One is a scenario, for example, as I already said before, where the space is kept too closed by the platform, for example, right? Then the feedback loop doesn't work as well as we imagine. Another example would be if the interaction of these players lead to outcomes that have a broader sort of systemic effects. For example, because of externalities, because of spillover effects that we don't like. And the panel before, for example, addressed one of those potential scenarios where we have perhaps effects on society at large that are undesirable. So I think in that framework of dynamic complementary innovation, we can actually much better pinpoint those situations when we can intervene. And we need to use that information to inform both agile innovation, but also hopefully larger institutional innovation that goes into Congress needs to inform new laws that govern that space. I'm not very hopeful that this will actually happen, and I'll close with this thought. I mean, I came here in this country in the late 1980s for the first time because I was so curious about how a system of regulation worked. I thought this is a great model that Europe could use. I grew up in a time of monopoly, state-owned telecommunications, where it took half a year before somebody would come by to bring you a telephone. And then sometimes, you needed a fax machine. It could well be that the telephone team showed up and said, sorry, we're the telephone team, we can't install fax machines. It took another half year before the fax team showed up. And for me, the American system was very appealing, very innovative, and I was really curious, and I ended up actually staying here and enjoying it. Now I'm afraid, though, that, and this takes us back to the leadership issue, that the US current model is not seen on a global scale as a leading example of how things should be organized. I do, however, share the optimism that it's possible for the US to come back to that leadership role, both where the federal government leads the 50 states domestically, and where the US takes on a stronger role internationally, or a different role internationally, that also will sort of project some of the benefits that the American model has globally.
Great, thanks, Johannes. As with the last panel, we will welcome questions, and for those who are viewing online, you can send questions one of two ways, either on Twitter at #AEI Digital Platforms, or by email to Sophie Rizzieri at aei.org. The link for her email address is on the event page. For now, let's stick with the last point, with Johannes' point about the United States in the world. And I'm very curious for Zach and Adam's reactions to this. So your own work is focused primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on domestic regulation. And I'm just curious, as you've thought through these issues, particularly with an eye to domestic regulatory institutions, just curious about your reactions to Johannes' point about the United States' role in the world, and to what extent and how do you think the U.S. should not just shape its own regulatory environment, but also do so in light to try to take the lead on international standards? We'll start with Adam.
Yeah, well, I think Johannes has got a really good point there. I think the American vision, to the extent we can articulate it and come to agreement on it, I think is obviously losing some ground internationally these days. In my next book on artificial intelligence governance, I talk a lot about the European model, the Chinese model, and then other hybrid models. And then what is the American model? What is our model now? And now in the 90s, let's just take a step back. We had a more coherent vision for the internet and the digital economy. And so we didn't really put a clear name on it, but in 1997, President Clinton came out with a framework for global electronic commerce. And it was a real paradigmatic sort of vision statement of how we should treat this new thing called the internet, which in the Telecom Act, people forget this, was kind of just like forgotten. It was just like barely there. You know, it was all about telecom and about like, what do we do about inter-LATA zones and like, you know, how are we going to deal with long distance telephony and broadcast television? And then buried in there was like a little brief mention of the internet. But then by 97, everybody was like, okay, we missed the boat on this. This is important. And the Clinton administration came out with this amazing document written by Ira Magaziner and others with Al Gore staff, basically saying this is a uniquely American opportunity to have a new fresh start, a new vision for this new media environment ecosystem. And it said it should be a market-driven arena. We should rely on contracts and common law and sort of more decentralized approaches, civil society interactions, multi-stakeholders, and so on and so forth. And, for lack of a better phrase, some have called it permissionless innovation. And so that model was really robustly tested in a transatlantic sense versus the precautionary principle with what happened over the last 25 years. And it won. As Zach pointed out, I mean, you take a look at all the world's leading unicorns in the field of digital technology policy, and it's a who's list of American tech companies. The leading tech companies across the globe are all American companies, and even in Europe, I mean, they've now basically decided they're just going to sit around and figure out how to regulate American tech companies because they've essentially decimated their own sectors so severely. And we're about to see a replay of this in the algorithmic technology policy circles with AI becoming the next battleground. And so I think it begins with a statement again of what is our America's unique innovation culture. How do we define what we're doing, what we want? Can we embrace a common vision for new types of computational technologies, AI, machine learning, big data, robotics, and the next wave of the digital revolution? I think that remains to be seen. I think it's a really unclear vision right now in Washington. I don't think there's that much bipartisan agreement. To the extent there is, it's more bipartisan in the direction of we should regulate all these technologies a lot more. I think permissionless innovation is a loser these days, and as someone who lectures about it frequently and goes to many audiences, I mean, it's got many, many enemies, and not just abroad. So I think these are trying times for the next technological revolution in this regard.
Yeah. Zach, any thoughts on the international question?
Yeah, so I mean, first I want to echo, I think there's sort of two key dimensions of this. One is sort of economic competition, and another is sort of like values-based. And so first, like to Adam's point, like, Europe has, I think, had some substantial failures to compete in this arena, and there are various reasons for that, and we can argue about what those are. But like one major rationale for their regulation is a sort of an assumption of sort of trade protectionism. The whole theory of some of what the EU is doing is that they're going after American companies, not because they have particular concerns about the way they're playing out. And their economic structure is really designed around competing with the US and Japan. And so that's one dimension, but there's also competition from China, something we've talked about, where we are in a much different kind of geopolitical rivalry. And in one where it's a very different dynamic than some of the protectionist conversations like Adam has written about Japan in the 80s, and all of these renewed conversations around industrial policy are a big part of that as well. But I think a really key piece of this is also the nature of values and the internet, I think, which was seen by early kind of utopians in the 90s, people maybe thinking about the framework that Adam mentioned, as a place that is sort of like blue jeans and rock and roll. It's something that you're exporting American values to the world, free speech, liberal commerce, all of these new possibilities. And I think we've seen a trend, partly because of a generational shift in Silicon Valley, partly because of increased regulatory scrutiny and all of these harms that are being discussed, away from these sort of core American values of sort of openness and free speech, and to Johannes's point, one of interoperability, which I think was a really key, that sort of decentralized governance of the early internet was, I think, a really key part of driving those values as well. And I don't think we have the moral high ground in the same way. I don't think we have a clear value, a clear vision for how values should be projected in the world. And so you see this balkanization where you might have the Chinese internet and you might have the European internet, and there's all of these sort of walls and barriers for data flows, and different regulatory structures. And I think that is a very dangerous thing, and one where the US is really the only country in a position to reassert a kind of freer, more open vision for global governance. And so I think that needs to start with how we think about dealing with these platform challenges at home. And part of that will be regulatory. Part of that will be imposing governance and changing incentives. There are a lot of regulations, I think, that encourage these sort of walled gardens and centralization that are just a byproduct of existing government structures, like thickets of patents, the DMCA's anti-circumvention provisions. Some of these things really encourage big central platforms. The CFAA is another piece of legislation that I think has really anti-competitive effects. So I think starting with clearing out some of these old regulations, with reasserting a more open vision for what the internet is, because really, I don't think technologies are ideologically neutral, and I think a lot of the policy, social, and economic debates that come out of them are downstream of how they're architected, whether it's an open source interoperable platform or whether it's a closed walled garden, which may present one set of challenges in the US, but presents a very different set of challenges when it's doing business in an authoritarian regime. And a country can say, we want all of your data on our state-owned servers, and we want to kick the following dissenting voices off of the App Store. So I think that's a place where that is the vacuum that US leadership should fill.
Can I just
Please, go ahead.
respond very quickly to this? And let me sort of use what I sketched very briefly before, just to give you another view of what we could see as a main role of platforms. Right? We also see sort of in this discussion how the limitations of the bottom-up sort of decentralized governance structure. One argument that one could make is that that the public internet was a fantastically successful innovation, and its decentralized governance structure also showed us that you can really coordinate a very dynamic space in very efficient ways, not only in the US, but also globally. So it's an impressive experience. At the same time, we can look at the internet as a governance structure that has reached its limitations, right? Where in the end, there were certain issues that could not be solved well in that space. One is, for example, quality of service across multiple autonomous systems in that space, or security issues, right? These issues were solved from an engineering perspective by IETF and others, but they could not be implemented because in a framework where you work on the principle of rough consensus and running code, there's nobody who can implement certain policies across the network. And we can look at platforms actually now as an institutional solution who came in to actually fix that kind of governance failure that we see in the public internet. Now, I think not many people perhaps have that perspective, but I think it's an important role that platforms fulfill. And on a global scale now, we have a co-evolution, if you wish, of, on the one hand, the public internet that is organized by one set of principles, and then you have a private, let me call it in a simplified way, this internet that is run by other principles. And the two really are not interdependent. They interact in many ways. And the discussions that we have currently really is of trying to figure out how can we learn from the experience in one world and the other, and how can we perhaps move forward with additional solutions to address the challenges that we have. And so from that perspective then, the challenge is one of change and time and learning over time, right? I mean, so we couldn't have anticipated the challenges that we face today 30 years ago, right? We couldn't have anticipated them 20 years ago, 10 years ago. One perspective that some people have is, well, we all failed, it all failed. This is not true, right? These are all decisions under uncertainty. Technology evolves under conditions of uncertainty where we really don't know where we're going. We're always pushing that frontier, right? And as we go, we learn and we reveal new information. That's really where we are today, right? We understand how the public internet works. We understand better how those private spaces work. And we see their strengths and weaknesses. And now we need to negotiate how we can actually align the technology space with the policy space, with the instruments that we have available. And I think, let me close with this, we have to come back to values. That one vacuum, I think, that where I see the US could really occupy a stronger role going forward is by articulating in different ways what the values should be that inform a good digitally enabled society. And I think we, for a long time, sort of somehow insisted or trusted that letting technology evolve freely will just lead us there automatically. And that's actually not true in a combinatorial space that is as vast as digital technology is currently, right? Because that path can lead you to a better place, or it can lead you to a worse place easily. So we need to have certain guidance as to where we want innovation to go. And I'll leave it at this.
Well, I want to stay on this theme, actually, and this question will go first to Zach. Both in terms of the soft law process that Adam described, where instead of trying to codify everything in advance, you leave space for flexibility, for learning. Maybe in some ways, soft law can eventually, we can learn from it, and it can educate the legislators who then eventually do codify something. So maybe from soft law, we can learn the things we need to know to eventually write harder law. And the same thing, though, Johannes, as you just said, might be in play with the platforms themselves, to the extent that they have asserted themselves as de facto regulators in aspects of our lives. So whether it's content moderation or other things on social media, whether it's the Apple App Store or other quasi-governmental roles of private companies, maybe there too there's a way for us to learn from experience, and that can inform, educate Congress, but then Congress could actually come in and write harder laws. Zach, do you see any sort of prospects for that? Is there a way that we can actually learn from these things and then legislate? Or is this just bring us back to the pacing problem, that by the time we draw lessons, the technology is just outpacing us anyway?
Yeah, I think, something I talk about in the paper is, we're still a long way from Congress as having the tools it needs to understand and assess the challenges posed by emerging technologies. And there's problems of having that internal expertise coming from different pieces of the legislative branch. One is the nonpartisan congressional support agencies or reports coming from congressionally chartered entities or other parts of the executive branch. They routinely get detailees, or they'll get reports from federally funded research and development centers or other entities like the national academies. There's a lot of these sources for expertise coming in. Some of them are of high quality and relatively unbiased. Others, the U.S. is sort of unique in outsourcing a lot of its policy formation to think tanks and even trade groups and more biased sources, which I think now skews a lot of Congress's understanding. And so we really need to rebuild expertise in a number of different places, some of which are explicitly partisan, some of which are nonpartisan. Committees are an example where, in the sort of committee area of Congress, and earlier this was really the central driving parts of policy formation versus now congressional leadership. And there were pathologies of that era too, people having to wait a really long time to become chair, and then ruling their particular fiefdom in sometimes very bad ways. But they also, putting the time in, developed expertise, in a hard-earned way over time, and built a staff that tended to stick around and have a lot of that expertise that formed over time as well, and also, staff that were big enough on committees to digest this sort of analysis and call out, when someone is, trying to present a case in a way that maybe not that well reasoned, whether that's from a trade association or whether that's from somewhere else. Now, too often, particularly in the House, the incentive is to, try for the underpaid, House staffer to want to go sell out and work on K Street and make 2 or 3 times as much money, and to cater to where industry is moving. And the downside of this is, while it can sometimes have a baseline that's biased towards industry, it can also breed reactionary movements, which I think we're seeing now with some of the insurgent populisms on both sides. So first, the problem is sort of rebuilding this ability to absorb expertise and the ability to generate expertise in a way that's timely, that's relevant, that's catered to the particular congressional context, which is a lot of think tank reports, and I'm guilty of this too, are talking about issues that may be are relevant to a donor, relevant to something we're interested in, but not really always relevant to what Congress needs. It's not really providing that sort of direct expertise and subsidy. So I think there are definitely places where you want Congress to provide space to, say, an area like emerging autonomous vehicles and see how it plays out, because we don't really understand that well enough. You still want them to be getting information and to have internal expertise to understand what's going on. They might hear one thing from NHTSA, they might hear one thing from companies like Waymo, and they need to be able to evaluate that, not just the sort of specific policy requests or positions of those entities, but also when they're making technical claims. Say, what's Tesla's risk factor for rolling out full self-driving for everyone? Elon has been a little fast and loose with this, but you don't really have the mechanism from a technical perspective to evaluate the differences between LiDAR or other technologies used in sensors. And so you really need to have that structurally built in, and that needs to not just be, the thing about Congress is, the 117th Congress had, it was, maybe like 3 or 4 scientists, 7 or so engineers, a very small number out of 541 members. Most of them are from law, business, politics, usually not a lot of STEM disciplines. Very few PhDs. Among those, a very tiny fraction is relevant to the hard sciences, and so really they need extra support in these highly technical areas. So I think that's the place to start.
Johannes, then we'll go to Adam. Anything further to add on how we might learn from soft law or from the sort of privatized regulation?
Yeah, so soft law faces a number of challenges, right? And it's a very appropriate tool for the environment that we're currently in. I should re-emphasize this. But in a paper that I wrote recently, and that's I'd be happy to share with people if you're interested in it, I identify a couple of sort of shortcomings. One is that frequently there's a risk that soft law becomes ad hoc-ish, right? I mean, we identify a problem. We have to sort of think more. It's not necessarily wrong, right? But we just need to be aware of it. I think we need to identify better what are the conditions under which we should use soft law for certain purposes. The second thing is we currently frequently don't know what the effects are of these soft law arrangements, right? So we need more information and need to learn over time. In fact, my favorite vision going forward would be we need to sort of think of governance kind of as a dynamic learning system where we make sure that we have access to the information we need to continuously evaluate. That's actually part of the OECD's sort of discussion on Agile Regulation, is that you continuously re-evaluate, monitor. There are trade-offs in the following sense, right? Regulation to some degree should be stable. The one argument I always hear from business people is, I don't really care as much how you regulate me, just as long as it doesn't change all the time, right? And it may be simplified and driven by interests, but the fact that there's a trade-off between frequent changes in regulation, which causes transaction costs, right? That again, depress innovation is an important issue. I think, let me just make a couple of things what Congress could do here, right? I mean, I think what would be really valuable in that context of being able to learn about how these measures affect us would be laws that enable us to get access to some of the information that's available in the digital space, right? Because this is paradoxical, but the internet and what's going on the internet is actually relatively undocumented. The information is available, but it's very, very difficult to access it. So we frequently run around with, sort of blind or half blind at least. I have a couple of other things, but maybe I'll just leave it at this for right now.
And Adam, as you're jumping in, one of the questions we've received from online, one of our viewers asks about the role of consumer protection lawsuits. And in some ways, the benefits of soft law remind me of the classic benefits of common law, right? Small decisions.
That's exactly what I was going to go into.
Well, then I'll shut up, and why don't you jump in?
So going back to your question about like what we can learn, what hard law can learn from soft law and vice versa, and I made mention in my remarks and in my paper about how soft law operates in the shadow of hard law and sometimes reinforces it or sort of facilitates it. But we need to maybe come up with a better way to think about this, which is really ex ante versus ex post, right? And few books have, I wish Professor Epstein was here today, because few books have influenced my thinking more on emerging technology policy than Simple Rules for a Complex World. And the way he sort of explains like how we have a variety of different types of remedies and approaches to deal with governance writ large, besides this sort of ex ante, top-down, crystal ball gazing effort to say like, let's figure out every theoretical harm and deal with it preemptively. I mean, that's the European model, and it just doesn't work. You need to have a more truly responsive process of learning by doing, muddling through, and the common law really helps us that. It takes cases and controversies as they come at us and sort of figures us out. But it also is complemented by consumer protection laws, unfair and deceptive practices, and a body of law that's often forgotten that I think is going to be greatly reinvigorated in the field of algorithmic sciences and technology, which is recall authority. People don't usually think of me as someone who praises the regulatory estate a lot. I think there's a lot of really useful regulatory mechanisms that are going to come in really handy. I've been doing work lately with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the FDA, on like how they can utilize recall authority to deal with fast-paced algorithmic technologies that are moving much, much faster than they can keep up with, but they come up with a soft law framework for guidance and say, here, all of these mobile medical devices that are going into your smartphone at the speed of light, we know we can't possibly bottle them all up and have a precautionary approach to all of that. But we can come up with some best practices that you should follow, bake in sort of privacy or security by design, and then ask you to sort of abide by those. And when things go wrong, guess what? You're going to get a call from us. And we know that this process has worked out in other contexts. I mean, look what happened to 23andMe when they tried to play the permissionless innovation card a little too hard, and the FDA was saying, you should come talk to us, you should come talk to us, and then a cease and desist notice landed on their doorstep in New York City, right? And they said, now you really have to come talk to us, your product's off the market, right? And so I think this is going to happen in a whole bunch of different contexts. I'm frankly surprised it already hasn't happened with Elon Musk. I think there's some very concerning problems with the way he has sort of like falsely led people to believe that there are capabilities there with, hands-free, or autopilot kind of stuff that just isn't there. I mean, I'm shocked that NHTSA hasn't launched a more formal activity, especially with his leading critic there now. And so I think the question from the audience is exactly spot on. I think we have a robust toolkit of regulatory remedies that I think we're going to have to reimagine and sort of partially reinvent and then sort of, again, muddle through and figure it out. But my key thing, my takeaway, my bottom line that I draw in the sand is like, let's not try to imagine we can do all this preemptively through a precautionary prophylactic approach to every theoretical technological harm that's out there. The way I put it in my last book was that if we spend all of our time worrying about hypothetical worst-case scenarios, and then we make hypothetical worst-case scenarios the basis of public policy, then many best-case scenarios can never come about.
We have some time for any questions from folks here with us today, if there's any questions from folks in the room. Go ahead, please. We'll just wait for the microphone to come.
Yeah, I'm Bob Hershey. I'm frequently here. I wondered about the approach of soft law, of can we just let it go along the way it's going now, or something more needs to be done?
First I want to say, I've been coming to policy events in this town for 30 years, and Bob Hershey's been in the front row of every single AI heritage event I've ever been a speaker at. This man's a diehard. By the way, do you still have your old Corvette? Sure do. Oh my goodness. Bought it. He's got a Corvette he bought in, what, 1963? 67. Brand new. Still has it. I remember the first time you drove me in at 92, man. You put me in your will, right? I get that car. Soft law has many ways it needs to be improved. A lot of the thinking that I've been doing with the folks at Arizona State University right now is essentially how to bring more formality to the informal, to basically say, can we come up with best practices for best practices? Can we come up with guidance for guidances? And there was some thinking put into this during the Trump administration at OIRA, and there needs to be a lot more done on this, because if we're going to live in a world where we have some of these ad hoc solutions and these informal efforts, I think I'm with a lot of other conservatives and libertarians who are very concerned about how that can be abused. And so hopefully we can bring some degree of more formality to this, also included tracking it. One of my former colleagues, James Brohl, spent a lot of time trying to develop models and efforts to sort of figure out how to track just guidance documents and like report on them. I think more needs to be done to sort of refine the best lessons from them and then figure out if they're applicable in other contexts. Again, it's a lot of learning by doing. We're kind of making things up as we go along in this regard, but I think it's some great use to it. I think it has to be the way it works in this world of sort of bottom-up household innovation and, combinatorial innovation.
Maybe I'll ask one last question then. something I've been thinking about throughout the conversation. For a few years now, when folks on the Hill would ask, how might they approach these technological issues? I'd say slow down, study, think hard, because the legislation you should pass should be landmark legislation, right? You think back to whether it's the Telecom Act of '96, the Communications Act of '34, and on. Laws that in their own way were sort of platforms for an entire generation of regulation. But when Johannes mentioned that we need to get out of the paradigm of old industrial regulation and the mindset of industrial innovation, it got me thinking that that era of lawmaking all the way through '96 really isn't away from a different technological era. And so maybe that last question is this: to the extent that Congress is going to act or should act, should it aim for comprehensive landmark-style legislation that creates the framework for a generation to come? Or should Congress just be aiming smaller and more narrowly for flexibility of its own on an ongoing basis? We'll start with Zach, and we'll just make our way back.
Yeah, I mean, so I still think, given the state of the institution as capacity, incrementalism is the best bet. I think, it's increasingly difficult to do these big landmark these big legacy packages. There have been efforts at it. We've seen, even in the kind of techlash context, there was a big, long series of hearings around economic concentration and antitrust that led to a bipartisan package of bills. And I think, I have a lot of critiques of the legislation that come out of that. I think most people on the conservative or libertarian side do as well. But that process is, interesting in itself, since it was a multi-year project of hearings that culminated in a nearly 500-page report. It's the kind of work that Congress used to do and needs to do more of, but is still, I think, struggling to complete. And so, while we might hope for federal privacy legislation that clarifies conflicts among different state bills or federal autonomous vehicles frameworks, I mean, these are possible, but I think what we're more likely to see is these sort of gradual incremental changes. I think one thing that Congress did well, thinking about the early internet and setting the frameworks that determine it, is define, these sort of safe harbor provisions. There was one in the DMCA that I mentioned. There, much is made of, I think, Section 230. And so you have these kind of structures that provide, defenses for new business models and innovators. I think I'd like to see something like that be created around interoperability in the digital platform space, but we can talk about that more. But I think there are these opportunities to at least sort of protect new models in a basic way from the overactive kind of regulatory apparatus that we have. I think the decentralized web and crypto is a good example, where just like a little bit of proactive defense would be helpful. And then, I'd also say that we, as I said in the beginning, this idea that Congress doesn't do anything in tech, which I think, maybe in digital platform regulation, there's an argument for that, but they do a lot of things in tech, the CHIPS Act, like federal funding and NSF and other places. So, I think we need to think more broadly. I think a lot of the gridlock also comes from the sort of entrenchment of lots of different incumbent interests that are spending a lot of money in Washington to try to stop things or try to do things. And the opportunities, if you go back to like the 90s, there weren't a lot of people throwing money around trying to influence something like Section 230, right? Like, I think, we have to think about what are the frameworks that will create the next $1 trillion American, tech company, and how do we kind of sneak something in, right? Yeah. In other legislative vehicles, in an omnibus, in a spending package that'll make way for that, even if no one else is talking about that. And those are the things that have big successes. I mentioned earlier, like Supersonic, which Mercatus helped lead, is a good example of that. And these are the opportunities we should be looking for.
Thanks, Zach. Johannes?
Big question at the very end.
Yeah.
There's a lot of evidence that in these dynamic technological environments that we currently have, there is not just one best solution. Right? I mean, so in that sense, I think having different approaches in different places, different regions of the world is actually not bad for the planet because we can learn from each other. Now, coming from Europe, I must say, looking back at what Brussels is doing, I'm alarmed actually, because I think this is many of the provisions that came out of the European framework in the last few years, right, fall exactly into that space that Adam has warned us against, right? I mean, we have a preemptive sort of antitrust or anticipatory antitrust and anticipatory regulation, and inadvertently this will narrow the innovation space that we are actually trusting will unleash by doing so. I can also see with sort of some alarm that model actually is very appealing to other parts of the world, right? And in part, not necessarily because it's so smart, but because the strategic, geostrategic and geoeconomic sort of environment is that the big platforms are mostly from the global north, and most of them actually from the United States, right? And so that really sort of puts us back to discussions that we have about termination charges and things like this, that we actually successfully eliminated in the late 20th century. And so what could Congress do? I think there's one area where Congress really could be very helpful. I mean, in addition to maybe a privacy law would be nice, right? But it could probably strengthen the ability for those agile forms of intervention, right? I mean, if we had strengthened antitrust provisions that would enable existing agencies to move faster, combined perhaps with different laws that would govern access to information, I think we could sort of navigate some of those challenges more quickly, and that probably would be a really important contribution to moving forward.
Thanks. And Adam, you'll have the last word.
I think the age of sort of comprehensive omnibus technology policy making is largely past. I think when we do get it, it's going to be responding to the squeeze between what the Brussels effect and the California effect results in, because there's a lot of comprehensive legislation happening in those two areas. And so a lot of what Congress is doing is going to be responsive to that and maybe either preempting it or countering it. But we're doing it so quite incrementally. And I think we're going to see the rise of a lot more experimental governments or a lot of the sort of so-called sort of move to sandboxing is becoming all the rage. It's like everybody now is talking about a sandbox for everything. But I think a lot of people can agree that that's a good way of trial and erroring a lot of different policies. And I'm all in favor of it. I think this is something that Congress has a far more likely chance of actually advancing. The idea that you could probably squeeze into a spending bill or something like, here's a provision that says the FAA must do this for supersonic or drones, or the FDA must do this for this or that. You know, there's a lot of ad hoc-ery there, there's no doubt about it. But I mean, there's something to be said for those sorts of experiments running their course, in addition to what's happening at the state level, where this is all the rage. I mean, I spent the last year working on sandbox bills in probably 15 different states. And some of them are very narrow and targeted. Others are very comprehensive, kind of a sandboxes for everything kind of approach. Others are like, let's just do it for drones or driverless cars. And this is how, when you go to Arizona, you see like driverless cars all over the road in Phoenix now, right? Done very informally, but in a targeted way. And so that may be the future that I think Congress will embrace if they just can't get the bigger measures through.
Now, with respect to spending, that is part of the conversation that'll follow. The next panel is going to focus on broadband access in underserved communities and the role the government might play. It'll be a slightly shorter conversation than the first two panels. We'll take a 10-minute break and be back at 4 o'clock. But before that, please join me in thanking our speakers.
My name is Brent Orrell, and I am a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, where I spend most of my time thinking about job training, workforce development, poverty studies. I do some work in criminal justice reform. And in all of that, I can tell you that there are few issues more important to disconnected and disadvantaged people than gaining access to broadband internet services as a prerequisite for getting to digital skills. And digital skills, as we know, are extraordinarily important in this economy. Between 75 and 90% of jobs in the United States will require advanced digital skills by 2035. That's not just familiarity. That's not just, I know how to open the program, but I know how to use these tools on the job. Disadvantaged youth, less skilled populations, other vulnerable individuals all need help in acquiring these skills to access the millions of good jobs that the US economy will be creating that require them. And access to broadband is a critical building block to the acquisition of these skills. You can't get there without it. A 2021 study by HHS found that 1 in 6, or about 15% of low-income individuals, lacked internet access. As a matter of securing our economic future and increasing access to good employment, getting to internet access is vital. In service of that objective, the federal government operates a range of programs, some quite old, as we'll hear later today, and others almost completely new. We'll hear about those as well. This afternoon's panel will seek to address whether those programs, as they are currently formulated, are effective in reaching the goal of expanding broadband access for disadvantaged and low-income populations. I'm joined in this endeavor by John Bailey and Daniel Lyons. John and Daniel are both senior fellows here at AEI. John studies broadband and artificial intelligence applications for education and has extensive government experience, including service on the White House Domestic Policy Council and at the US Department of Education. Daniel Lyons focuses his research on telecommunications and internet regulation. He's an assistant dean of academic affairs and a professor of law at Boston College Law School. He is also the author of an important paper that has already been published, I believe. Is that correct on this?
Will be soon, yeah.
It will be soon. On assessing broadband affordability initiatives. We were also going to be joined by Thomas Johnson, the former general counsel of the Federal Communications Commission. He had planned to be with us, but unfortunately he contracted COVID and thought it might be best for all of us if he stayed home. So Thomas is a contributor to this larger project, and his paper on digital platforms can also be found on the AEI website, or will be able to be found soon. So that's our introduction. And in talking with John and Daniel, what seemed to me to make the most sense, and we'll see if this works out as intended, but John has a great kind of bird's eye view of the big picture of how the federal government organizes itself around broadband issues and other education, telecom kinds of issues. And I thought it would be helpful for him to kind of give us the big picture of both kind of the existing programs, but more importantly, the major new initiatives that were included in the infrastructure bill that passed Congress. I guess that was earlier this year. It feels like I can never remember. I'm losing track of time. Yeah, earlier this year. And then we would move to Daniel for his discussion of his research on the effectiveness of some of those programs in terms of whether they actually do what they're intended to do in building access for low-income populations. And then we'll just have a conversation among the panel, and eventually we hope to bring in some questions from outside. If you are watching live on live stream, you can send questions to hashtag AEI Digital Platforms, or you can email Sophie. Sophie, your last name is Rizziera, Rizziera at, or Sorry, RIZZIERI at AEI.org. Did I get it? Did I get it right? Okay, great. So let's get started. John, give us the big picture.
Great. Well, it's so great to be with you all. I need to have Sophie's last name as like my password. That'll be like unhackable. No one will ever guess that and hack that. So that would be the strongest password. That was great.
Yes.
Right. So I mean, the broadband picture, it's complicated in part because it's a patchwork of programs. You have a whole set of programs over at the FCC, funded through something called the Universal Service Fund mechanism, which I think we'll talk about, and actually one of the papers did talk about this, because this is a program that is under increased strain because we keep adding and expanding eligible services to it, expanding populations to benefit from both discounted telephone services all the way up to discounted broadband services for individuals, as well as in high-cost areas, as well as for schools and libraries. But it's funded by a funding mechanism that is under increased stress. And so the contribution rate has been going up through a declining set of funds. And that is one of the reasons why Thomas's paper is so important. It's also why the FCC and Congress are in the midst right now of trying to modernize that particular funding structure to support hopefully some modernized programs. And I know we'll talk about that too. But you also have programs over at the Department of Agriculture that helps service rural areas. And then you have a whole slew of broadband programs totaling probably close to $100 billion through all the different tranches of federal COVID relief, including the Infrastructure Act. But not just because of the Infrastructure Act. There was also some other programs that predated that, that often got at essentially three different aspects of broadband. One is availability. And this is the one that's sort of most intuitively obvious, that you have rural areas that have just no broadband availability. And they're capital intensive. You need huge subsidies up front or support up front to help make it affordable for telecommunication providers to build out the future-proof fiber optic networks that can help service these high cost and underserved areas. You have affordability, and this is getting lots of sort of debate right now, but that's just because you have broadband in a community doesn't necessarily mean it's affordable for low income and even in some cases middle income families. And so there's a whole host of subsidies that have been plussed up in the Infrastructure Act through the FCC that provides discounted broadband discounts for low-income families. And then you also have adoption. And this is just because you have broadband in your community, just because it's affordable doesn't necessarily mean people know how to adopt it or use it. Now, the pandemic here helped because in many cases, there were a whole slew of people who just thought broadband was a luxury. And then all of a sudden, when everything shut down, broadband became a necessity. If you didn't have broadband, you as a kid didn't necessarily have access to education. You couldn't access your government services. So if you wanted to sign up for unemployment benefits, you couldn't go to a closed government building to fill out the paper forms. You had to do it online. So all of a sudden, what was a luxury good became a necessity in many respects. And what we saw is that those who were disconnected were shut off from accessing PPP loans, accessing their unemployment benefits, or quite sadly, and we're seeing the ramifications of this now, kids that didn't have access to high-speed internet couldn't participate in Zoom classes, couldn't participate in remote learning, and that has just set them terribly behind as it relates to their academics. So there's a whole slew of different programs, but the one that's sort of a flagship right now and is getting the most attention is something called the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, BEAD. And that's $42 billion. It's allocated over to the U.S. Department of Commerce through NTIA, and then that will now go out through a formula to all 50 states. All 50 states are in the process of developing their broadband plans that essentially put out how they're going to tackle those issues of expanding availability, so how they're going to build out networks to underserved areas, how they're going to make it affordable, and how they're going to have this equity component to it. They have 9 months to put together plans that will allocate their funds for the next 5 years. This is a huge challenge. I know today we're going to talk a lot about the federal challenges. These are immense challenges for state governments for a couple different reasons. One, Up until about a year ago, only 20 states had broadband offices, which means that right now governors are cobbling together staff and trying to put together organization units that can help begin developing these plans and also allocate the funds through competitive grant competitions, through contracts, through a whole different litany of different types of programs there. But second, you have this transition coming up. We're in a mega election year, 36 different governor races, at least probably 20 new governors. So a lot of this work that's going to be started by governors now will have to be handed off and transitioned to a whole new set of governors who will have to finalize the plans and submit that to NTIA. So lots of different challenges there. Not to mention that so much of this rests on data and broadband maps that the FCC has to produce. And that mapping process started in June. Data was required to be submitted by telecommunication providers by September, but it looks like those maps won't be available for another couple of months. And that sort of slows everything down, especially on the state planning. The reason these maps are so critical is because that is what's identifying unserved and underserved areas. Unserved, it means areas that have very slow internet speeds or no internet availability. Underserved means areas that have availability of broadband, but it's at a much slower speed. It's below 100 megabits per second download speed and 20 megabits per second upload speeds. So to understand where an unserved or underserved area is, you need maps. And unfortunately, these maps are delayed. There's also, we're hearing from industry and even from some state and city governments that they're questioning the accuracy of this maps too, and there's a whole challenge process. And so the governors and the mayors that have more data will be able to challenge and hopefully be able to show where they have more underserved or less underserved areas. That's going to qualify them for more of those BEAD fundings too. But that's a little bit of an overview.
That's great. And I've already got several follow-up questions I want to ask you, but before we get into that part of it, so Daniel, the federal government is not new to the rodeo of subsidizing telecommunications services for low-income populations. And you've spent a lot of time looking at what we've already done as it relates to both broadband internet services as well as telephone services in earlier days. Why don't you walk us through kind of your paper and tell us what we know about the effectiveness of federal subsidies to try to expand access?
Sure, yeah. I think John's absolutely right that broadband availability is super important. That the basic tenet of universal service, which has been a cornerstone of American telecom policy since the 1934 Act, right, to make sure that we're bringing affordable service to all Americans, is a good one. And even more important now in the broadband era because so much more of our lives have moved online. So we have to make sure that as we continue to move into the digital age that we're making sure that low-income families are not left behind. Unfortunately, I don't think the federal government does a good job at this, or at least it's not proven that what it does actually affects low-income adoption rates at all. So the biggest program historically that we've had to help low-income families afford service is a program called Lifeline. Lifeline originated in the Reagan administration. As it exists now, it offers eligible households $9.25 a month toward purchase of a broadband plan. Someone's eligible if their household makes less than 135% of the federal poverty guidelines, or if they qualify for one of a number of other federal anti-poverty initiatives, things like Section 8 housing or SNAP benefits and things like that. But despite being asked multiple times by Congress, by the GAO, by academics, the FCC has never shown that the money that it spends on Lifeline has any measurable effect on broadband adoption rates to make sure that the money spent is actually helping low-income families get online who would otherwise lack service. In fact, when the GAO said, do you have any studies, the FCC pointed to 2 studies that in fact proved the opposite. One suggested that as much as 88% of Lifeline dollars every year are spent on households that would have kept their service without the subsidy, meaning that's money that's simply being wasted from an agency mission perspective. And so the question is, what should we do about this, right? So the FCC has been challenged by the GAO, they've been challenged by Congress to come up with a program evaluation mechanism, a way by which you can show that the money that you're spending on this program, which is about $1 billion a year, it's going to about 8 million households. How do you show that this money is actually doing anything to close the broadband gap? In response to the GAO report, Grant Thornton did an independent audit of the program, which basically said the good news is it looks like the broadband gap is closing, that low-income families are increasingly coming online. The difficulty for the FCC is that the closing of the gap more low-income families getting online coincides with fewer families taking the Lifeline subsidy. It's gone from 12 million families about a decade ago to only 8 million now. So their conclusion was there's absolutely no evidence that what Lifeline is spending every year has any effect on the rate that we're seeing. The reason why this is important is not just because Lifeline is spending $1 billion a year on this, that should be reason enough, but the new COVID-era programs that John was highlighting earlier doubled down on this, or tripled down, or 14. What's 14x? So one of the initiatives that comes out of the Infrastructure Act was the Affordable Connectivity Program, which basically is Lifeline on steroids, right? Instead of spending $9 a month, now we're going to spend $30 a month per eligible household, and the eligibility requirements have expanded. So everybody who is eligible for Lifeline is now eligible for ACP and a lot more. So we're spending more money on a broader range of households, but we've committed the same basic problem, which is we've not proven that the money that we're spending, the households that we're targeting, are the ones who are at risk of falling off the grid if we were not to give them service. And in fact, I think just running the numbers, it's highly likely that the vast majority of ACP funds are going to be wasted as well, because 76% of low-income families already have service. So if you're giving $30 a month to any low-income family who asks for it, 3 out of 4 of those dollars are going to go to families that already have a plan, and so you're not actually increasing broadband adoption rates. The nice thing about ACP is Congress has actually focused on this problem for the first time in a generation. And if they can think about how to do it the right way, I think you could actually get a very good program out of this. But it involves, rather than just assuming throwing some money at low-income families and doing the politically expedient thing is going to solve the problem, actually doing a study to find out, among the low-income population, who are the families that are not currently online? And more importantly, why are they not currently online? The Pew Internet Research Institute, which has the best data on this, has shown that affordability is the #1 reason why families that are not online say they're not online. But it's not the only reason. Other reasons cited are equipment costs, right? Other reasons are, I just don't think broadband is for me. And so that suggests some form of digital literacy might be a component. So what I think makes a lot of sense is to do a study to figure out who is the target population. Once you understand who these people are, who the low-income families are who are offline, then you can design eligibility criteria that focuses just on them, sort of very targeted laser-like approach, rather than sort of scattershot, throw money at everybody and hope some of it will lead to broadband adoption. And then once you understand the population, you can also understand what subsidies make sense, right? In addition to affording the monthly payments, maybe it makes sense to offer some amount of money toward purchasing equipment costs, some amount of money toward digital literacy to convince people that they should be spending some of their family budget on this. And ultimately, I think rather than doing what Lifeline does, which is give the subsidy directly to telecommunications carriers, I think it makes sense to give subsidies to the families themselves in the form of a voucher that they can take from provider to provider. I think we can talk about this a little bit later. I think ACP gets some things right as far as correcting some of the errors that Lifeline originally had, but its basic problem, the basic flaw that's built into it is replicating Lifeline's problem of assuming without proving that the money that it's proposing to spend and the population it's proposing to target is actually going to lead to an increase in broadband adoption rates.
So could the two of you talk a little bit about, sort of we've got a legacy program for subsidy, and we've created a new subsidy to be administered by, anyway, talk about that, if you would, and how, I think you said, Daniel, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing on this.
Yeah, so one of the interesting outcomes from ACP, you'd think if we're going to create this new program, what Congress might want to do is wind down the old program, but they didn't, right? So what it means is that while the FCC is giving $9.25 a month to people who subscribe to Lifeline programs, ACP is also giving $30 a month to the same families plus more for subscribing to programs. Now, there's some difference between the two. One is that Lifeline only works for these carriers that the government has certified as eligible telecommunications carriers, which aren't the carriers that most people use. It's not Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile. It's Assurance Wireless and TracFone, companies that are specialized in using the Lifeline system to target low-income families over time. But the problem is it's become cumulative, right? So now we don't know, the FCC is not coordinating well with ACP to figure out whether both of these should exist or not. One of the recommendations I make is if ACP is going to continue, then Lifeline should probably be wound down. For some of the reasons that Tom highlights in his paper, that the universal service mechanism that we use to fund Lifeline and some of the other FCC universal service programs is increasingly anachronistic. It's a huge expense and growing expense that's funded using a surcharge on a shrinking base of telecommunications revenue. And so it makes sense, I think, for if ACP is going to be doing the work that Lifeline is supposed to be doing, to shutter Lifeline and reduce at least that burden on the Universal Service Fund.
So do I have this right, that we have these two existing things that we administer at the federal level, right? And then we've created a new, basically a block grant or formula grant to the states to do access, but it also has a subsidy component, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you could see this nesting itself pretty quickly, that all the state plans, as they have to address both the build out of networks, but then also affordability. And some of that is up to the discretion of governors. Governors could fund a voucher. They could require, as part of their grants to telecommunication providers, that if we're going to subsidize you to build out a network, you have to offer a plan at some sort of discounted rate for both low income as well as middle income families. So there's a bunch of different design challenges that governors are going to have to wrestle with. And then also think too, how does that relate to Lifeline and to this Affordable Connectivity Fund as well? So,
what could the possible rationale be for maintaining these federally governed initiatives and having a state subsidy program? How does that fit together in your mind, or Daniel, free to answer?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple different thoughts on this. Depending on who you talk to, the Affordable Connectivity Program is either a temporary emergency program or it's the prelude to a more permanent program. But you have to sort of go back to kind of when these programs were set up. The Affordable Connectivity Program is the replacement for the emergency broadband benefit. And that came out in the midst of the height of the pandemic, when we were still mostly a closed society, when people were still mostly at home. And it was a trade-off. Congress was faced with a trade-off that because speed of getting funds and subsidies to families was sacrificed at narrowly targeting the funds and maximizing the impact. We saw this with a whole range of different programs. PPP again, it was all about speed, not necessarily about sort of maximizing impact or targeting in the best way. You sacrifice that trade-off a little bit. The Affordable Connectivity Program, depending again who you talk to, is supposed to be the bridge to when states are able to set up their affordability program and to buy time for the FCC and for Congress to hopefully modernize the Universal Service Fund and Lifeline. That has proven to be very difficult. Some of these are like third rail issues over at the FCC. And so that's why I think there's a healthy skepticism that what looks to be a temporary program might in fact become more permanent. And then also that, it complicates the picture and where you can end up stacking a lot of these subsidies down at the local level.
And the thing I'd add to that is, right now, thus far we've been talking about only one aspect of universal service, the affordability, right? How do we get low-income families online? The bulk of the dollars is being spent on the initiative that John highlighted at the beginning of his remarks, which is build out, right? Getting networks to places that don't have service right now. And that's an even bigger right-hand, left-hand problem. It's been going back at least a decade because in addition to the FCC spending universal service money on this, Congress has traditionally appropriated money to the Department of Agriculture to build out some of these. The new Infrastructure Act adds $40-something billion in federal money and state money to solve these problems. And it's intriguing to me because, so in 2010, at the initiative of Congress, the FCC adopted this thing called the National Broadband Plan. And at the time of the National Broadband Plan, they estimated that in order to close the availability gap, to make sure that everybody has service who doesn't already have a network passing by their house right now, I believe they said it would cost about $20 billion. We have spent several multiples of that between 2010 and 2022. And yet now we're continuing to say, and now we need 42, 43 billion more. And it just makes me wonder, where did it all go? And why don't we know more about how much? This is an enormous amount of money that is being spent in a relatively unaccountable way, often in a duplicative way because the Agriculture Department is doing some things, the FCC is doing some things, state governments are doing some things, but not in a way that's being tracked and in a way that's being intelligently coordinated. This is one of the things that GAO has criticized the FCC for.
So how big a problem is the availability issue? Do we have any quantification on that? How many actually unserved or underserved, how much of America is unserved or underserved? Do we know?
This is where the map problem comes in, right? Because the whole point of these broadband maps is to decide once and for all, where are the gaps in our service and how many people are not served and where they're at, right? The FCC during the Pai administration gave a number of grants to states to be, by service area, right? So identify areas that lack availability, and they used a reverse auction mechanism, which is actually pretty smart, to get companies to bid on the area in exchange for a pot of money that they're going to use and promise that they would wire everybody in that area. The vast majority of those areas went for sale, and some of them, the service provider of last resort were satellite companies like Hughes or Elon Musk's new Starlink company, right? Who ended up filling the gap when places there weren't a lot of bidders. If you include the satellite providers, 99% of the country is covered. Now, do we include satellite or not? The satellite guys are always really good at building a state-of-the-art network for about 5 years ago, right? Because our demand for broadband, the number of things that we do online outpaces their ability to deliver service at scale. But they're catching up, and as they catch up, depending on how you argue about it, right, the satellite covers quite a bit, and wireless covers quite a bit. 94% of Lifeline subscribers aren't subscribing to fixed broadband in the home. What they're subscribing to is wireless plans, wireless broadband plans. And if Lifeline is considering that to be adequate broadband service and it meets the speed minimums, then I think there's a good argument that even setting aside the satellite problem, the vast majority of America is covered by at least high-quality wireless.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge for a couple different reasons. One is that this was just alluded to, the definition of broadband has changed as we've become increasingly more, not just sophisticated, but just hungry consumers of it. So now, now we have, at least through Congress, has sort of established these definitions so that this idea of 25 megabits per second download speed and 3 megabits per second upload is considered to be pretty unserved, because it's just, if you have a family with 3 kids trying to do Zoom school and a mom trying to get a telehealth appointment and a dad trying to fill out some other government forms, that's not going to be, even though it technically shows up as broadband, that's not sufficient broadband speed. So having this goal of 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second starts pulling into a picture whether or not where coverage is and the availability. The challenge is that, again, we just don't have great data sources on this. The FCC has been tasked but wasn't given money necessarily to do these updated maps. Microsoft has a map that actually is relatively pretty sophisticated, because they pull data in from the Census Bureau, from the FCC, from their own Microsoft data, and so that gives a picture. States have their own mapping project. California has a pretty robust set of data about availability of telecommunications services in different types of areas. There's another nonprofit called Education Superhighway that has done speed tests with kids at homes, and that gives you a sense of not just is broadband available in the area, but what are the actual speeds that families are receiving. But the fact that we're sort of this far into our sort of broadband journey and we still lack really trustworthy data is just sort of endemic of what we just experienced during the pandemic, that some of the best data was not in the federal government, it was in outside, that if you wanted whether or not schools were closed, some of the best data was here at AEI with Nat Malkus's Return to Learn tracker. It's true with some of the broadband data that it's going to be found more in the States and probably even with some companies.
So I'm curious from you, John, you are more on the education side of this rather than the regulatory subsidy side that Dan focuses on. If you were empowered to make a decision about how to use limited resources to improve not just, if you were empowered to make a decision about how to improve digital skills for kids as they are progressing through school and getting ready to enter the economy or higher ed or whatever it is that they're doing, is this the best use of limited resources, do you think? Is expanding access to broadband the right place to put the emphasis, or could the money better be spent in some sort of educational effort?
Well, I think, again, it actually is a regulatory question. It goes to some degree, but that, again, is part of these governors' plans. Governors have to figure out a little bit of a digital literacy aspect of it. And that's everything from job training, building out these networks are going to require new workforce. That's a workforce development program. Do you do that through an apprenticeship? Do you do that through your community colleges or through some other type of job training? It is about digital literacy and going out, almost household to household. Heartland Forward, which works with a lot of Heartland governors, they have a connection core, which they train people that literally can go door to door for the elderly and for low-income families and help them with not just signing up for benefits, but learning how to use broadband. And then obviously in schools, I think I worry a little bit less with schools. Kids tend to be digital natives and are gravitating, in some ways a little bit too fast online for things. And again, schools have been using, through some of the federal subsidies, through something called the E-rate program, have been tasked with providing some digital literacy as part of that. So I don't know. The thing that worries me the most is I do worry about the federal government not getting some of this right, but I worry that there's 50 opportunities for governors to not get this right too. And part of the reason I worry about that is not out of malintention, but just, again, when you have more than 20 states that haven't had an office thinking about this, this is a lot to ask of them. They have to do planning, they have to do mapping and data analysis, and then come up with their own competitive programs, their own subsidies. That's a lot of design challenge with very little sort of capacity building to help set them up for success.
Yeah, 50 chances is a lot of chances, I have to say. Dan, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so John mentioned the E-rate program. I didn't get into that in my paper, but that's another example of we're spending on something that sounds really good without really testing how well it's working. So Lifeline spends about $1 billion a year. E-rate is spending about $2.5 billion a year out of the same fund.
It's four.
I'm sorry?
It's $4 billion.
$4 billion now. Yeah. Okay, so even more, even greater point, right? And the idea behind E-rate is we're going to make sure that we're providing internet access to the country's schools and libraries. So which is fantastic, but it's not means tested. And so what it means is when school districts apply, they get the money and it goes out, but the school districts that benefit are the ones who know the program exists and can afford to apply. So you end up with a lot of money going to places like the Beverly Hills School District, where it's basically displacing local money that would otherwise be spent anyway. So if the goal is to make sure that that the nation's schools are wired, that we're using federal dollars to wire schools that otherwise wouldn't be wired, the lack of means testing and E-rate means there's a significant amount of waste there too. How much, I don't know, but it gets back to the broader point of the FCC's never thought really hard about why we're spending the money we're spending, and is there a smarter, more targeted way to do what it is that we're doing? And given the size of the Universal Service Fund and the, as Tom's paper pointed out, the limited revenue base from which it's drawn, it seems like that analysis is long overdue.
E-rate's interesting too, because it has this, it's not a total direct subsidy program, it's a discount program. It's sort of skewed where the wealthier districts get a lower discount, lower income districts get a higher discount, but it is, you've had this accumulated set of forms and regulatory protections to some way to go against fraud, waste, and abuse that's made the program, now the biggest barrier for the program is just the complexity of filling out the forms. And Mike McShane, who used to be a scholar here, talked about like no single raindrop ever thought it was to blame to be the flood. And it's a little bit of that. Like you've had all these accumulated checks and balances that it's made it so difficult that now the smallest, most rural, poorest districts have the most difficulty filling out the forms. And when I talk to schools, they all appreciate the E-rate, but they all say it's by far the most complicated federal program that they apply for, and it requires a real sort of specialization. There's a lot of E-rate specialists. They're almost like accountants. Like they all have to follow changing E-rate guidance and eligible services and tranches of fundings the way that tax accountants have to follow changing dynamics with the IRS and tax law.
So we've got 30 states out there who have been working on this, 20 have not. When you think about the 30, either of you, please feel free to jump in on this, but when you think about the 30, which states would you say rise to the top in terms of the thoughtfulness of their approach on broadband?
Well, I mean, a couple.
And why?
And why? Explain your answer. Show your work, family. A couple. Ohio, I think, has done a good job. Governor DeWine was prioritizing broadband build out in rural parts of Ohio way before the pandemic hit. They have a pretty sophisticated mapping operation there. North Carolina has always jumped out at me. There is another debate. We haven't talked about it, but there's a debate around something called municipal Wi-Fi networks where instead of the private sector building out and owning and operating a network, you have a government entity building and owning and operating a network. And this has been, in telecom politics, a very hotly debated topic. And on one side, you say, we need these municipal Wi-Fi networks because the private sector isn't building out to it. The private sector says, my gosh, like if your taxpayers are subsidizing the network, there's no way we can compete. And then it also further erodes demand and creates less of an incentive for them to build it out. North Carolina came up with a third operation, a third way in all this, and Governor Bev Perdue, and it's carried through where they've worked with a lot of their public entities, including the university systems, school systems, hospital systems, and state and local government, to aggregate demand and then build out a network that is built and operated and facilitated by the private sector. And so North Carolina continues to be top of the list. California, I think, also has a really good mapping system. I don't think they have a great plan for distributing funds and building out networks, but they have a good sort of sense of the depth and breadth of the problem there, too.
That's terrific. Do you want to?
I was going to say, as much as it pains this Boston resident, New York actually has a fairly robust system. And I mention this because during the Pai administration, when the FCC was distributing build-out grants, New York applied for a waiver that asked, instead of the FCC administering grants in New York State, can we do it ourselves? And the FCC was quite happy to say, yeah, you can do our work for us, no problem at all. But New York then administered the grants themselves, which was a good experiment, I think, in federalism. My sense, just greenfielding it, is that these dollars are better put in the hands of states, which understand the challenges of their individual, whether it's terrain or population or whatever, better than a handful of folks at the FCC in Washington can. And so I think devolving some of that to the state level is probably a good thing. New York was experimenting with it, and I was glad to see it. Now, were the experiments successful? I'd say mid, right? They're the ones I was mentioning earlier, where when they didn't have any takers in the auction, they ended up giving the money to the satellite companies, saying, okay, the satellite company's gonna wire this area, we're calling it a day. Then when the next round of funding came out for areas that had not yet been wired through the preceding auction, New York came asking for money, and the FCC said, no, we gave you a pile of money. You gave it to the satellite guys and certified to us that those areas were now served. And so that became a big political football in between Congress and the agency.
It's quite interesting when I think on the other side of the ledger with the 20 who haven't. Those are states, I mean, first of all, we've got a nationwide shortage of expertise around these issues. I mean, where would a state even go to start finding the people that they would need to staff up an office to do an effective job? That, to me, sounds like a huge hurdle that states are going to be facing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, California has, sort of, I mean, they're
California.
with the envious, given that they have Silicon Valley in their backyard. I think other states, often it's research universities. Back when I worked with Governor Tom Ridge in Pennsylvania, we did a broadband mapping project, which I don't think at the time it was that revolutionary. It turned out to be more revolutionary than it was, but we worked with the University of Pittsburgh that works with the telecommunication units to sort of map out. In fact, that map, it used to be publicly available. They had to take it down post 9/11 because it ended up sort of illustrating critical infrastructure points, where all sort of broadband or networks would feed into one building. If you took out the building, it would take out, a lot of East Coast traffic. But it took, again, us working with universities. Schools are an awful easy way of also getting some of this data too. That's what Education Superhighway found. But it does take some attention out. And I should also say that even though most governors haven't established an office, they do have task force. They do have some other sort of collaboration across their state agencies to try to help tackle this. But I think often it's going to be working with their private sector. I think to this point, if you go into any governor's office, they all know the ISPs and the telecommunication providers in their states. There's always like one or two big ones and bunch of small sort of mom and pops, but you can often sort of rally them to help with sharing data too and helping with planning.
That's terrific. Okay, want to open it up to the audience, see if there are any questions for the panel. And I don't think we've got any online, but you'll let me know. Yeah, Adam.
I'm just curious, this isn't the first time we've considered a real nationwide build-out of infrastructure to improve the quality of day-to-day life for Americans, right? The Tennessee Valley Authority being the most famous example. And I don't know how the New Dealers went about it. I don't know if they went and surveyed folks in the Tennessee Valley to see, did you not get wired up because, it was too expensive, because you just don't want this? They just kind of did it. And I'm wondering, to what extent should that inform the mindset of states or localities or even the federal government now? The extent to which we ought to just do a build out now, thinking that if we could do it in a cost-effective way, it would improve the quality of life. And even folks who don't necessarily know the value of it now, they'll benefit from it immensely. I mean, to what extent Is there a bit too much paralysis by analysis? And to what extent is maybe this just good government and being, good stewards of limited government resources?
So I've thought for a long time, this is one of those long brewing projects that never get done, right? Wanting to look at the Rural Electrification Administration as an example, to compare it to broadband today. Because it was a great example, like building electricity wires out to the farms all over America. One thing that I realized in my preliminary research on this is different than what we did now, is those were in the forms of loans. They were loans given to individual homeowners, right, that could build out and pay it off over time. Now, they were sometimes forgivable loans, but they had skin in the game, right? They were what Tim Wu called homes with tails. Tim Wu had recommended doing something similar with regard to broadband several years ago. Never really got off the ground. But going directly to the beneficiaries and having them have some skin in the game seemed to make a really big difference. As opposed to now where we're granting money to carriers and then not following up on whether they're actually putting it in or whether there's no communication between the FCC and the end user consumer that you're trying to benefit. So there may be some lessons to be learned there at some point I would like to explore.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think you're exactly right. Especially, if you're a governor and take a step back, these are one-time funds, at least through the BEAD program. And so if you have one-time funds, how do you spend that not on things that necessarily are higher recurring costs, but things that have very expensive one-time costs? And often that is digging the trenches and building out the fiber to these areas that it's been very expensive to sort of build out to. And yes, right now there may not be huge demand on the other side of that fiber, but you can envision over the years as demand for broadband increases, and not just on entertainment with streaming and with gaming, but you're seeing agriculture being completely transformed with precision agriculture and with a lot of sort of more technology, and that's driving up demand for broadband. Even towers, even if you're going to build wireless towers, the wireless towers still at some point need to connect to fiber. And so this is the perfect opportunity to use this one-time funding for these really capital-intensive projects to build it out and then complement it over time with what is going to be an ongoing debate from the FCC about the best way of subsidizing and affordability. But right now, if you're a governor, I would prioritize building out to these really expensive underserved areas.
One challenge is that there's sort of two different build-out problems, right? One is, because it's all driven by population density, right? You need a certain number of paying customers per square mile for the business to make sense. One segment of the unserved are those where we can't afford, the existing customer base is not big enough to afford the build-out, but if you gave us a network, then there's enough customers on there that they would be able to cover the monthly operating costs. That, I think, is a segment that fits really well with the kind of build-outs we do. There's also ultra-rural areas where even if you give us a network for free, our customer base isn't even going to cover the monthly cost of operating the network. That's a more difficult problem, and I don't know how you solve that one.
There's also ways of doing this, I think, jointly. When we did our broadband mapping project with Governor Ridge, we found all this dark fiber that was in the northern tier. That's some of the most rural parts of Pennsylvania. And we were curious, who owned this fiber? And it turned out it was a gas company. And they had, as they built the gas pipeline or gas lines, they just laid fiber there, and it was dark. And we're seeing right now, with the ongoing debate in Congress right now with Senator Manchin and permitting reform. And what's the permitting reform? It's to sort of build new pipelines for natural gas and for a whole variety of other types of energy projects. Every single time you're digging a trench and laying a pipe, that becomes an opportunity to also stack on top of that fiber. And so there's a way to combine some of this. But again, that goes to governors thinking in this kind of multidimensional way, that as they're competing for some of these energy projects, as they're competing for the broadband dollars, how to sort of make that all work together in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, I would really appreciate it if they'd stop digging up my road in front of my house every 3 months to put in a new pipe of some sort. So that'd be great. Are there other questions in the audience right now?
Well, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I had actually a comment and then a question. The comment is that broadband policy really sort of illustrates to a certain degree the inability to learn from past mistakes, right? Because in 2010, by 2008 when it started, 2009 ARRA, the federal government adopted a lot of sort of quick fix measures to rejuvenate and stimulate the economy. And the broadband map initially came out of that sort of very quick policymaking process, right? And a lot of compromises were made, and we knew actually from 2010, because there was a bunch of researchers and consultants at NTIA in 2010, when Larry Strickling was still the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, who said, you know, that map is flawed. And then what the irrationality kicks in is that for the next 10 years, subsidy decisions were made on a map, based on a map that we knew was flawed. And as far as I understand the internal workings, I mean, this may be wrong, but the story is that Congress did not appropriate or give the FCC money to fix the map, right? But now, 12 years later, we are trying to do the same thing, quick money, because the problem pressure is really high. But rather than sort of having a sort of more sort of a rational approach to the mapping problem, we're going to a completely new experiment with a completely new map that is arguably way more accurate than the old one, right? But to make good policy decisions, actually, I don't need a precise map of the locations that are not served. I can actually design policy by, for example, using reverse auctions that would work without that. But the question is this: you've talked mainly about infrastructure, right? But what we do know about modern digital technology is that infrastructure is just one layer, right? And to harness the benefits for society, we need to go beyond the infrastructure layer. And one of the new features of the new programs is that they actually emphasize digital skills and upskilling and so forth. And I was wondering whether you even if it goes a little bit beyond the infrastructure panel, whether you could comment on where you see the country going in that regard.
I'll take that. Not fast enough is where I see the country going on the skills front, just generally. And as I said at the beginning, we know that it's going to be basically impossible to get a job in this country that would be sufficient to support a family or have a pathway to it that would allow you to get to that level of income if you don't have these skills. So infrastructure is like necessary but insufficient. It's one of the building blocks, and we've just got, and it isn't just in this area, but we've got communities that are behind and falling behind faster as technology picks up speed, not because they aren't trying, but because it's just very difficult for the sort of the strongest among us to keep up, and those problems tend to multiply among more disadvantaged populations. So I'm very concerned about it. It's like watching you've fallen overboard and you see the ship, moving off toward the horizon, and it's picking up speed, and you can't swim any faster. And so I think it's a huge issue.
Yeah, I mean, Brent's scholarship here at AI has like really charted that out and talked about it. And it's true, we used to think of like there were tech jobs and not tech jobs. And the increasing reality is that every job is becoming slightly more tech and higher tech. You could go 3 blocks from here at AI, and there's an Amazon Go store that's cashierless. You just walk in, you grab a bunch of stuff, put some stuff back, walk out, and Amazon bills you. That is a novelty right now, but that is very going to increasingly sort of creep into the retail space. There's a great, I love when my passions intersect with my work. Catherine Hall, the Hall Estates, makes a great Cabernet, and they use it with an artificial intelligence grape sorting tool that does the work of, it's an optical sorting machine where the master winemaker sort of goes out to the harvest, takes 100 of the grapes that represents the grapes that he thinks is going to make a great wine, feeds it into this AI system that looks at the shape of it, the color of it, the opacity, with the color, the light that goes through it. And then it starts sorting 3,000 grapes a minute and does the work of about 12 day laborers in a half a day. And that's makes a great wine, but also displaces a lot of workers and creates a new high-tech type of job at a vineyard that wasn't there 5 years ago. And so I think this is right. Like those skills are creeping into every job a little bit faster, and you're seeing that. It's another reason why this broadband digital literacy is going to be so important.
But you do raise a good point about sort of as you go up the stack, right? The problem gets more complex. When you're talking about the infrastructure layer, like laying the wire that allows for connectivity, there's only a handful of ways you do that, right? You dig a trench, you put in fiber, you put in coax, or you put up a tower for wireless. It's a pretty, there's a finite set of things that government policy can accomplish. When you start talking about things like digital skills, like what does that mean, right? As you go up to the application layer, right? We're talking about using Facebook, using Twitter, right? The range of things encompassed by the phrase increases exponentially, which I think is why it becomes a lot harder policy-wise to figure out what is good federal policy for subsidizing digital skills or digital literacy, as opposed to just building infrastructure out.
Yeah, just from a training standpoint, I mean, I'm increasingly convinced that the pace of the change is so rapid that we literally can't anticipate what might be useful. Mm-hmm. And so it's really trying to build skills for agility into the workforce. Allow people to pivot and then resource them to be able to access the training that they happen to need at that moment, because we will never get ahead of this in terms of understanding the implications of the technology. So, great question. I think that's probably it for today. Oh, we've got one more here, real quick. We've got to wrap up. Yep.
Hi, my name is Ed Dieterle. I'm with ETS. One of my colleagues is Erwin Kirsch, who's been overseeing the PIAC study on behalf of OECD for many years. That's an international survey of adults from 18 to about 64. Erwin has identified here inside the United States that there are about 37 million people in upper high school grades, as well as the adult workforce, that cannot read to learn, cannot communicate to persuade, or use numeracy to analyze. But he also has another interesting finding that I didn't hear you all talk about. He also identified about 30 million people of working age in the United States that have demonstrated on PIAC that they have literacy. Mm-hmm. However, they lack the credentials in order to demonstrate to potential employers, to universities, to government, to military, that they have what they need in order to be successful. I wonder if you all have also been thinking about that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, just speaking for myself from a workforce standpoint, I happen to be a fan of undergraduate degrees. I'm one of the last people who thinks that's a good idea, but I do think it's a good idea. But it's a third of the population, and there are an awful lot of folks out there who need alternatives to that, including short-term credentialing. And I think there are some really interesting things going on in that regard. Had a great meeting last week with the president of the Western Governors University, and they're doing some really fantastic things on short-term credentialing as well as the degree programs that they offer. So yes, we need to be in that business. When I say we, I mean everybody who's concerned with education and training. So absolutely. Okay, we are up against the end of time, and well, the end of today, not the end of time. Adam is going to come give us a parting exhortation.
Ended on a dark note there, Brandon. I knew when the last panel started talking about wine, it was probably time to wrap it up. But before we thank the last panel, I just want to say one last time, the papers that have been published so far in the series and the ones yet to come, you'll find them at platforms.aei.org, which again, as we've said a few times, is supported through the generosity of the Knight Foundation. I do want to thank all the authors and our speakers today, but also more than that, I want to thank everybody who either wrote papers or is writing papers or who participated in the conversations that gave rise to this entire series. We hope that this project spurs many more conversations yet to come. But thanks to all of you who've joined us online, and thanks for everybody who joined us here in person today. And please join me in thanking our last panelists.